The corridor was silent for exactly 3 seconds, after Preston Vale grabbed her arm. Not the nervous quiet that falls when doctors argue, or the held-breath hush of a code blue. This was something older and uglier, the silence of 37 adults who saw exactly what was happening and chose, in the same instant, to do absolutely nothing. Elowyn Mercer heard the snap before she felt it. Then the floor came up fast, and her vision went white, and she was down on the cold, polished tile with her arm bent at an angle that wasn't right, that would never be right again, without surgery and weeks, and everything that comes after. And Preston Vale was standing over her, straightening his coat, like he'd simply moved a piece of furniture that was in his way. He looked at her. She looked back. "Withdraw it," he said. Same voice he used to order lunch. Through the pain that was already climbing into her shoulder, into her jaw, Elowyn took one breath. "You just made a serious mistake." Vale walked away. 12 meters down the corridor, a man who had seen worse things than this, far worse, in rooms that didn't have cameras, stood completely still and watched Preston Vale disappear around a corner. Then he took out his phone and made one call. If you've ever watched someone suffer, while the people around them looked away, you already know exactly what kind of story this is. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss a single moment. And before we go any further, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because what happens next inside Blackridge Medical Center will stay with you long after it's over. Elowyn had not planned to be a woman who filed formal complaints. That wasn't who she'd set out to become when she finished nursing school at 22 and took her first trauma rotation in Baltimore, all adrenaline and sleepless nights, and the particular exhaustion that comes from caring intensely about strangers. She'd imagined a long career built on competence, on being the person in the room who kept her head when everyone else lost theirs. She hadn't imagined paperwork. She hadn't imagined learning how to document violations in language precise enough to survive a legal challenge. Hadn't imagined memorizing the hospital's internal reporting procedures or learning which administrators genuinely listened and which ones smiled while they calculated the cost of listening. She learned all of it anyway. Baltimore taught her the first lesson. A patient died, a man in his late 50s, a retired contractor with a bad heart, and 3 grandchildren whose photographs his daughter kept taped to the wall of his room. He died because of a medication interaction that should have been flagged. Every investigation that followed cleared Elowyn of any wrongdoing. She had documented correctly, flagged correctly, escalated correctly. None of that mattered. The story that ran in 2 newspapers and 1 local television segment attached her name to the word negligence in the kind of proximity that lodged permanently in search results and made hiring managers hesitate. She'd read the coverage in a coffee shop near the hospital, on a Tuesday morning with rain coming down the windows, and felt something she'd never quite felt before. Not grief, not anger, but a cold and thorough understanding that the system she'd trusted to be fair had no specific obligation to be fair to her. She requested a transfer. When the transfer didn't come, she resigned. Chicago was supposed to be a clean start. Blackridge Private Medical Center was prestigious, well-staffed, and far enough from Baltimore that the name Elowyn Mercer meant nothing to anyone who worked there. She took the senior trauma nursing position because it was the right level for her experience, and told herself she would keep her head down for a year, build trust, and then cautiously begin to be herself again. Keeping her head down lasted about 4 months. It started with billing discrepancies. Small ones. The kind that appeared in the gap between what a procedure actually involved and how it was coded for insurance submission. A sound like green wood splitting. She noticed the first one by accident during an overnight shift when she was reviewing a patient's discharge paperwork, and something didn't match the care record she'd personally maintained. She assumed it was an administrative error. Then she found another one. Then 6 more across different patients, different procedures, different attending physicians, but the same pattern. Extended recovery periods that couldn't be explained by the patient's actual condition. Procedure codes that described more intensive interventions than what had actually occurred. Insurance claims built on a foundation of carefully constructed fiction. Elowyn didn't panic. She made copies. She started a notebook physical, not digital, because she'd learned in Baltimore that digital evidence had a fragile relationship with institutional servers and the people who administered them. She built her documentation slowly and carefully over the following 8 months, the way a person builds anything that needs to hold weight. By the time she understood the full scope of what she was looking at, the number she'd arrived at was $40 million annually. Preston Vale's name appeared throughout the records, with a regularity that could not be coincidental. She sat with that knowledge for 2 weeks before she filed anything. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to be certain. Fear and certainty are different things, and Elowyn had spent enough of her career learning to distinguish between them. She filed the complaint 6 weeks before the afternoon in the corridor, through 3 separate internal channels with copies submitted outside the hospital to 2 external regulatory bodies. Vale knew within 48 hours. He didn't come after her immediately. That was the part she hadn't anticipated, not his anger, but his patience. He made her wait, passed her in hallways without acknowledgement, looked through her in meetings. She felt it, that particular cold shoulder that a person in authority can deploy like a weapon. The statement made entirely through absence that says, "I have decided you don't exist." Then on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks after the complaint, he found her in the corridor. She was carrying 3 patient charts and walking toward the nursing station when she registered his presence ahead of her and had just enough time to recognize what his expression meant before he stepped directly into her path. "We need to talk," he said. "I'm working now." She had been in the hospital long enough to know that 37 people were in or near that corridor. She had chosen the moment because of the witnesses, because she had always understood that Vale's particular brand of intimidation depended on privacy. He was the kind of man who applied pressure in quiet rooms with closed doors. She had been wrong about that. He grabbed her left arm above the elbow. She felt the grip before she processed it, and then she processed it very quickly, the way the body processes certain information faster than conscious thought can follow. She tried to pull away. He twisted, and the sound she heard, that flat, awful crack, was the radius bone giving way under torque, applied by a man who was stronger than she was, and in that moment, didn't care what it cost him. The floor was cold. Chicago winters leave cold in buildings even when the heat is running, and the tile against her cheek carried that cold clearly through the fog of pain that was already rearranging everything else in her mind. She registered the faces of the people around her, her nurses, she knew, a resident she'd helped through his first trauma code, a pair of administrative staff she recognized from the 3rd floor, and every one of them was frozen, completely immobile, doing the calculation that people do when they witness something they didn't expect and can't quite believe. She understood their paralysis without forgiving it. She looked up at Vale. He was adjusting his coat, not breathing hard, not looking around at witnesses, just pulling his lapel back into place with the calm of a man who had decided the consequences didn't apply to him. "You'll withdraw the complaint," he said, "when you've had time to reconsider." Elowyn took one breath. The pain was extraordinary, a bright, specific agony radiating from the break site up through her shoulder. But pain was something she'd spent her career working around, and there was something else present that was stronger. A clarity, the kind that comes from finally seeing a thing without any remaining ambiguity. "You just made a serious mistake," she said. He walked away. She stayed on the floor for exactly as long as she needed to, which was 30 seconds. Then she set down the charts carefully, because they still contained patient information that mattered, used her good arm to push herself upright, and began walking toward the treatment wing. Someone offered a wheelchair. "I'm fine," she said. She was not fine, but she was moving, and for the moment that was enough. Ronan Halewick had not planned to be in that corridor either. He had been at Blackridge for 3 days, which was already 2 days longer than he typically stayed anywhere that wasn't his own territory. His brother Bennett was in room 412 with a cardiac condition that the doctors described in language carefully calibrated to convey serious concern without specifying anything Ronan could actually act on. And Ronan Halewick was a man who acted on things. He dealt in specifics, in leverage and clarity, and the kind of decisions that required information rather than estimates. The doctors had not been giving him information. They'd been giving him estimates. He was walking back from the administrative wing, where he'd had a conversation with the hospital's patient liaison that had been polite and completely useless, when the silence ahead of him changed quality. He'd been in enough rooms when the wrong thing happened to know that particular silence. It wasn't absence of sound, it was sound being held, collectively, by people who'd witnessed something and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. He stopped. He watched Vale grab the woman's arm, watched the twist, watched her go down. He did not move forward. Later, people who knew who Ronan Halewick was would wonder about those 4 seconds, the gap between the woman hitting the floor and his hand going to his phone. Some would interpret it as calculation, others as coldness. It was neither. Ronan Halewick had learned, at considerable personal cost, that the first impulse is rarely the useful one. First impulse in a situation like this, walking up to Preston Vale and doing what 37 frozen witnesses apparently couldn't bring themselves to even contemplate, would have felt correct and accomplished very little. Vale would be injured, perhaps badly. Ronan would be arrested, which created complications for an organization that depended on his freedom to function. The surveillance footage would likely be wiped before any charges could be built on it. 4 seconds of stillness, then the phone. His first call secured the exits not to trap anyone, but to ensure that certain people didn't quietly leave before they could be formally identified. His second call, within 90 seconds, was to a man who understood hospital security infrastructure well enough to obtain a copy of the relevant footage before the hospital's own administration could make it disappear. He watched Elowyn decline the wheelchair. He watched her walk. He stayed in the corridor for 11 minutes after Vale disappeared, until he was certain the immediate situation had stabilized. And then he went back to his brother's room and sat in the chair beside the bed and looked out the window at the Chicago skyline and thought about what he'd just seen. He stayed at the hospital for 6 more hours, not because of his brother, who was stable and sedated and didn't need him present, not because of Vale, who was his problem only tangentially, and not yet in any way Ronan had fully calculated. He stayed because of the woman, because he had watched her lie on a polished hospital floor with a broken arm, which is a specific and singular kind of pain, bone pain, the worst of the mundane varieties, and look at the man who'd done it with an expression that contained no fear whatsoever. Not defiance performed for the witnesses, not the theatrical bravery of someone doing it for effect. Something quieter and more durable than bravery. She had told him he'd made a serious mistake. And then she had gotten up and gone back to work. Ronan Halewick, who had made a career of understanding exactly what a person was made of under pressure, who had built an organization on his ability to assess individuals quickly and accurately, sat in his brother's hospital room and admitted to himself quietly that he wanted to know who that woman was. Elowyn came back to work 3 days later, with her left arm in a cast from wrist to mid-forearm. She had not taken the full week her orthopedist suggested, because taking a full week meant giving the hospital and the people who wanted her gone from it 7 days to work with her absence. She had spent those 3 days at her apartment reorganizing her documentation, reconstructing from memory the portions that had been stored only in the notebook she knew would eventually be searched, and making arrangements to store copies of everything in multiple locations she didn't keep at home. She came back on a Wednesday morning, signed in at the nursing station, and was 20 minutes almost Cinecans when Vale appeared at the end of the hallway. She watched him register the cast, watched the small recalibration that moved across his face, not guilt, nothing as useful as guilt, but something like surprise that she had returned at all. He began walking toward her. Elowyn raised her voice to a register that carried clearly through the entire wing. "If you come within arm's reach of me, I will scream until every person in this building knows exactly what you did. I have the fracture documented. I have witnesses identified, and I have copies of everything in locations you cannot access. Touch me again, and I will make sure the last thing you ever do in this hospital is the walk from your office to the exit." He stopped. The hallway was not empty. It was never empty. There were 6 nurses, 2 residents, and 3 patients visible from where Elowyn stood, and every one of them had heard her clearly. Vale stood at the end of the hallway for approximately 4 seconds. Then he turned around. Elowyn went back to her charts. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she registered without judgment. Steady hands mattered during procedures. In a confrontation in a hospital hallway, they were irrelevant. She'd said what needed to be said, and it had worked. And the slight tremor in her fingers as she turned the page, simply the body processing adrenaline on a 3-day-old injury, which was a medical fact and not a character flaw. It was during her lunch break, 4 days after her return, that Thaddeus Corvin found her in the small break room on the 3rd floor. He was not what she'd expected. She had been at Blackridge long enough to know the owner by reputation, the kind of reputation that precedes a person in the form of carefully selected anecdotes that add up to a portrait of controlled excellence. What she had not expected was the warmth. Not performed warmth, not the professional cordiality of an executive doing damage control, but something that felt genuinely calibrated to her, specifically a quality of attention that suggested he had read her file, understood her history, and arrived prepared to be the person she most needed in this moment. That was exactly what made her careful. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "I want you to know that what happened here is unacceptable. What Dr. Vale did is unacceptable. I want you to feel completely safe to tell me everything you've found." She looked at him across the table. "Thank you," she said. "I've submitted everything through the proper reporting channels. My documentation is complete, of course." His tone remained warm. "But if there's anything additional, anything you haven't included in the formal submission, anything you're still processing, I want you to know my door is open." She recognized what he was asking. He wanted to know what she had that wasn't yet in the official record. He wanted to know the edges of her knowledge, what remained undocumented, what she might still be working toward. A man with nothing to hide doesn't frame a conversation about institutional wrongdoing as an invitation to share the parts you haven't officially submitted yet. "I think the formal submissions are comprehensive," she said. "But I appreciate the offer." Corvin held her gaze for a moment. Smiled. "Of course," he said again. He left without pushing further. Elowyn finished her coffee, threw the cup away, and went back to work. She also made a note in her reconstruction that Corvin had sought her out within 4 days of Vale's assault, and that the nature of his questions suggested he had detailed knowledge of what her complaint contained, knowledge that, if he'd obtained it through legitimate channels, should not yet have been available to him. She filed that note with everything else. 3 days later, Ronan Halewick appeared at the nursing station and asked for her by name. She came out of a patient room and found him standing in the corridor, not hovering, not performing patients, just standing with the particular stillness of a man who had somewhere better to be and had chosen not to be there. He was larger than she'd registered from a distance in the chaos of that first afternoon. Late 30s, a face that had been in weather and difficult rooms and carried the evidence of both without apology. "You have the footage," she said. "Yes." "Why, I was there." "So were 37 other people," Elowyn said. "They didn't do anything either." Something moved in his expression, not offense, but a kind of recognition, like she'd named a truth he'd been expecting her to get to eventually. "No," he said. "They didn't. So what makes you different?" "Different choices." She studied him for a moment. "That's not an answer. It's the honest part of one." She didn't have time for this conversation. She had 4 patients to check on, and a medication review due in 40 minutes, and she was aware that this man had done something genuinely useful by securing that footage, which created an obligation she didn't particularly want and certainly hadn't asked for. "The footage," she said. "What do you want for it?" "Nothing. Nobody does something for nothing." "I did," Ronan said. "And I'll prove it by giving it to you now. No conditions. No conversation required. What you do with it is your business." She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know who you are." "I know," he said. "That's something you can fix if you want to." She went back to her patients, but she thought about it. She thought for 2 days. She thought about it for 2 days, and on the 3rd day she came back to the nursing station and asked the unit clerk if the man who'd come asking for her had left a contact. He had. She called. They met in the hospital cafeteria during her break, the most public, most surveilled, least private location she could have chosen, which he understood immediately and didn't comment on. He sat across from her with a coffee he didn't drink and answered her questions with the same quality she'd noticed the first day. Not dishonest, not evasive, but careful with the specific truth rather than the general impression. He told her his brother was Bennett Halewick, hospitalized in room 412. He told her he'd been at hospital 3 days when the assault happened. He told her that the footage was secured and preserved and available whenever she was ready for it. He did not tell her his full name yet, and she did not ask because she understood instinctively that there was an order to this kind of information and that rushing it would only produce a version edited for early consumption. "You've been back," she said. "Yes. Bennett is stable. The cardiac situation isn't acute anymore. You don't have a medical reason to still be here." "No, then why are you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I want to understand what kind of person you are." "You could ask. Asking gets you what someone wants you to believe. Watching gets you something closer to the truth." Elowyn picked up her coffee. "That's a very particular way to think about people," she said. "It's been useful. I imagine it has." She finished her coffee. Set down the cup. "My locker was searched yesterday," she said. They took a notebook. Something shifted in his expression, small, but present. "Did they get what they needed?" "No," she said. "Because I'm not an idiot." For the first time, Ronan Halewick almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. A thing that was the thing that happens to a person's face when they encounter something they genuinely didn't expect to be impressed by. "Good," he said. "I want the footage submitted to external investigators," Elowyn said. "Not internal, not anyone connected to this hospital. I can arrange that." "Through what channels?" "Channels that don't trace back to you," he said. "Or to me, if you'd prefer." She looked at him. "Who are you?" she asked. Not the name, the real question. He didn't look away. "The kind of man," Ronan said slowly, "who you probably shouldn't trust and probably will anyway, because the people you're currently fighting are worse, and you're too honest to pretend you don't need help." The cafeteria hummed around them, trays clattering. Someone's pager going off across the room. Elowyn sat with that for a moment. "That," she said finally, "is either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 6 months or the most sophisticated manipulation I've ever encountered. Which do you think it is?" She gathered her things and stood. "I haven't decided yet," she said. She walked back to her patients. Behind her, Ronan watched her go and did not follow, and that restraint, the specific restraint of a man who was accustomed to moving when he decided something mattered, was in its way, its own kind of answer to the question she'd asked. The following morning, Elowyn arrived at the hospital and discovered that every piece of digital evidence she'd submitted through internal channels had been deleted from the hospital system. She stood at the computer terminal on the 3rd floor and stared at the empty file paths and did not panic, because panic was a luxury she'd stopped allowing herself somewhere around month 4 of the investigation, and because she had the backup, had always had the backup, had built the entire structure of her investigation around the assumptions that this exact thing would eventually happen. But she needed to know who had done it. She took the evidence she had to Dr. Maribel Ashcombe. Maribel had been the head of nursing at Blackridge for 11 years and was the closest thing Elowyn had to an institutional ally, a woman who had, on 3 separate occasions in the past 18 months, quietly supported Elowyn's positions in meetings where that support cost her something. She had a reputation for integrity that was specific and earned rather than simply asserted. She listened without interrupting as Elowyn laid out everything: the billing discrepancies, Vel's assault, Corvin's careful questions, and when Elowyn finished, Maribel sat very still for a long moment before she said anything. "You should be careful," she said finally. "Very careful." "I know that." "No." Maribel looked at her. "I don't think you understand how careful. These people, Elowyn, this goes higher than Vale." "I know it goes higher than Vale." Maribel pressed her lips together, said nothing else. 3 days after that conversation, Ronan told her where the deletion had originated. He said it quietly, in the cafeteria again, in a voice that didn't carry past their table. He said it with the specific care of a man delivering information he knows is going to hurt. The deletion had come through credentials connected to Maribel Ashcomb's office. Elowyn sat with that. Are you certain? She asked. Yes. She didn't say anything for almost a minute. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with the clarity of the corridor moment, the sharp crack of something breaking in a single instant. It arrived slowly, like water through a compromised foundation, the gradual realization that something she'd built her sense of safety on had already been undermined, long before she'd thought to check. She had trusted Maribel with everything. She had shown her the evidence. And now that evidence was gone from the system, and the pathway led directly back through a woman who had just 4 days ago told her to be careful. Elowyn set down her coffee cup. All right, she said. All right? Ronan looked at her. That's it? I have the backup, she said. I have it in 3 locations. Whatever they deleted, I still have. That's not what I know, what you're asking, she said. You're asking if I'm okay, and yes, I will be. But right now I need to figure out how deep this goes, and I need to figure out who else might be compromised, and I need to do all of that before I decide what to do about Maribel. She looked at him. And I need to know, she said quietly, exactly who you are and exactly what resources you have access to, because I think we've arrived at the part of this where pretending I don't need to know those things is going to get me hurt. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. Tomorrow evening, he said. If you can get to the roof. She could get to the roof. She went home that night and sat in her apartment with the backup files spread across her kitchen table and thought about the series of decisions that had brought her here from Baltimore to Chicago, from a transfer request to a formal complaint, from a hospital floor to a cafeteria table, across from a man she hadn't yet decided she could trust, but was beginning to suspect she might have to. She thought about the notebook they'd taken, the evidence they'd deleted, Maribel's face across the table, careful and warning, saying, "These people go higher than Vale." She thought about the fact that she was 30 years old, with a cast on her arm and an investigation that had just gotten significantly more complicated. Sips. She thought about Ronan Halewick, his name she'd found in 3 minutes of search, once she'd decided to look sitting across from her in the cafeteria, and telling her, with something close to honesty, that she probably shouldn't trust him, and probably would anyway. She looked at the evidence on her kitchen table. She thought about the man who had lain on the floor of room 412, who apparently had a name and a role in all of this that she didn't yet fully understand. She thought about 37 people who had stood in a corridor and done nothing. She thought about a man 12 meters away who had made one phone call. She didn't sleep well. But in the morning, she got up, pulled on her uniform, secured the cast under her sleeve, and went back to work. Because that was what Elowyn Mercer did. The roof access door at Blackridge was propped open with a rubber wedge that the maintenance crew used during equipment checks and never quite remembered to remove afterward. Elowyn had known about it for 11 months. She pushed through it at 6:47 in the evening, still in her scrubs, cast on her left arm. A paper coffee cup in her right hand that she'd gotten from the vending machine on 4, because the cafeteria closed at 6, and she hadn't eaten since noon, and the coffee was bad, but it was warm. And sometimes warm was the entire point. Ronan was already there. He was standing at the eastern edge, looking out at the city, and he didn't turn when she came through the door. Chicago was doing what Chicago did in the late fall, pressing its skyline against a sky gone orange and gray and mean at the edges, the kind of light that makes the city look like it's bracing for something. She stopped a few feet from him. You said you'd tell me who you are. I will. Then do it. He turned. His face in that light was harder than it looked in the cafeteria. The outdoor version of him, she thought, was a different proposition than the cafeteria version. More edges. Less effort spent on making things easier for the person across from him. My name is Ronan Halewick, he said. I run an organization in Chicago. Criminal. We control distribution networks, financial infrastructure, and a number of operations I'm not going to describe in detail on a hospital roof. Elowyn took a sip of her bad coffee. A crime organization. Yes. You're a mafia boss. He didn't blink. That's one word for it. What word would you use? The same one, he said. I'm not going to dress it up for you. You asked who I am. That's who I am. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind off the lake was sharp, and it moved through her hair, and she didn't look away from him. "And your brother," she said. "Bennett, he's in this too?" "He's in the organization. And his cardiac condition." Something's in Ronan's expression changed barely, but she was trained to read subtle physiological shifts, and she caught it. A tightening. Something that lived between anger and something more complicated. "We're still assessing that," he said. She filed that answer carefully. "All right," she said so. "Criminal organization. You control parts of Chicago. And you were in this hospital, in that corridor, and you watched a surgeon break a nurse's arm in front of 37 witnesses, and instead of walking away, you secured the exits and pulled the footage." "Yes." "Why? I told you why. You told me you wanted to understand what kind of person I was." "That's not a reason. That's a description of curiosity." She set the coffee cup down on the roof's low ledge. "People in your position don't act on curiosity. They act on calculation." "So what's the calculation?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone stalling, the quiet of someone deciding how much of the accurate answer to give. "Thaddeus Corvin," he said. The name landed differently than she expected. "The owner of this hospital," she said. "The owner of this hospital," Ronan confirmed, "has been operating a criminal enterprise inside territory my organization controls for approximately 4 years. We became aware of the edges of it 8 months ago. Your investigation into the billing fraud gave us a map of the interior." Elowyn stared at him. "You've been using my investigation. Your investigation overlaps with mine. That's not the same thing." "It is exactly the same thing." No, his voice stayed level. "Using you would mean directing your movements, feeding you information to obtain specific outcomes. I haven't done that. What I've done is watch what you found independently, because what you found independently is more detailed and more thoroughly documented than anything my people had assembled. That's not using you. That's being grateful you exist." She picked up her coffee, put it back down. "You should have told me this from the start. You wouldn't have believed me from the start. That's not your decision." "You're right," he said. "It wasn't. That's why I'm telling you now." The wind came again, harder this time, and somewhere below them a car alarm started and then stopped. Elowyn looked at the city because looking at Ronan right now required more composure than she currently had access to, and she needed 30 seconds to get it back. She had built her investigation from scratch, alone. On overnight shifts and lunch breaks and evenings in her apartment with printouts spread across her kitchen table and a physical notebook that she'd filled with careful handwriting because she'd trusted nothing digital. She had done all of that in a hospital where someone had been watching her the entire time, not Ronan, but Corvin's people. Faoud eventually searched her locker and deleted her files, and she had kept going because she'd believed she was moving towards something that mattered. She had not expected to discover on a rooftop that her investigation had also been quietly observed by a criminal organization with its own interests in the outcome. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing you haven't already decided to do." "That's a convenient answer." "It's also true," Ronan said. "You're going to finish the investigation. You're going to submit the evidence to external investigators and regulatory bodies and anyone else with jurisdiction over what Corvin has been doing. That process doesn't need me, but it does need your evidence intact, your person intact, and your credibility intact. Those 3 things I can help protect." She looked back at him. "And in exchange—" "No exchange," he said. "Corvin's operation collapsing is its own return. I don't need anything from you for that. You need my evidence. I have enough of my own. Yours will put people in prison. Mine will simply stop the operation." He paused. "I'd prefer prison." She studied him. The honest thing, the thing she'd been circling since the cafeteria and couldn't quite land on, was that she believed him. Not completely complete belief in a man who'd just told her he ran a criminal organization would constitute a clinical failure of judgment, but enough. Enough to register that the specific quality of his honesty had a texture she recognized from years of listening to people tell her things in hospital rooms when they were frightened, and had stopped calculating what she wanted to hear. People in pain tell you things differently than people who are performing. Ronan Halewick, on a cold Chicago rooftop, had the specific delivery of someone who had decided the performance wasn't worth the energy. One condition, she said. Name it, you never manage me. You never decide what information I can handle or what I'm ready to know. If you have something relevant to my investigation, you tell me. Even if you think it's going to be hard to hear, especially then. He looked at her without flinching. Agreed. And if you break that, she said, we're done. Whatever this is, whatever we're doing here, it ends immediately. Understood. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and dropped it into the metal waste bin beside the door. The deletion from the hospital system, she said. Trail runs through Maribel's office. I need to know if she initiated it, or if someone used her credentials. I'll find out. How quickly? 24 hours. She nodded, moved toward the door, stopped Ronan. He waited. If you ever withhold something from me, because you've decided it's for my own good, she said, I will find out, and you will not get a second conversation. She went back through the door. Behind her, Ronan stood on the roof for a long time after she left. The 24 hours turned into 18. Elowyn was at the nursing station the following morning, working through a medication reconciliation that required more concentration than she currently had available, when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she'd just added to her contacts. It wasn't a digital trail, it was direct. She read it twice. Put the phone face down, stared at the medication chart, without seeing it, for approximately 45 seconds. Then she finished the reconciliation, transferred care to the day shift lead, and walked to the small consultation room at the end of the wing that was at this hour empty. She sat in there for 7 minutes. Then she got up and went to find Maribel. She found her in the head of nursing office on the second floor, a room that Elowyn had been in perhaps a dozen times over the past 18 months, always for legitimate reasons, always with the specific comfort of knowing she was in a space where the person across the desk was on her side. She had found that comfort useful. She had relied on it in the particular way you rely on things you believe are structurally sound. She closed the door behind her. Maribel looked up from her desk, and her expression did something complicated, a sequence of small movements, recognition, and something beneath recognition that lasted less than a second before her face settled back into its professional arrangement. Elowyn, she said, sit down, I'll stand, a beat. All right. Elowyn looked at her. Tell me how it started. Maribel's hands, resting on the desk, went still. I don't know what you. Maribel, her voice was flat and even, not angry. Something harder than angry. Don't. You're not going to sit there and tell me you don't know what I mean, because you're not stupid, and neither am I, and I am out of patience for this particular kind of performance. Tell me how it started. The silence in the office had a specific texture. Outside the door, the sounds of the hospital continued, pagers, footsteps, someone's voice down the corridor asking about a patient in room 6, and inside, 2 women sat on opposite sides of a desk, and one of them was deciding whether to keep lying. Maribel closed the folder in front of her. 6 years ago, she said. Elowyn didn't move. My husband was out of work. There were debts. Medical bills from my mother's situation, and 2 mortgages, and I made a decision that She stopped. Started again. Corvin approached me. He was still building the hospital at that point, still assembling his administrative structure, and he said he needed someone in the nursing leadership who understood how clinical records worked, how they could be adjusted. He said it was minor, that it was billing optimization, that insurance companies were the only ones paying, and they had margins to absorb it. And you believe that? I wanted to, Maribel said. There's a difference. Elowyn stood still. How much did he pay you initially? 40,000, over 6 months, and then he had the records of the arrangement. Maribel's voice was very quiet. And the 40,000 became leverage, and the leverage became what it became. I stopped being paid. I started being managed. For 6 years. Yes. And the deletion, Elowyn said, my files. Maribel looked at her hands. He told me what you'd submitted. He said if I didn't clear it from the system, he'd submit the initial arrangement to the licensing board. I'd lose my license, my pension, everything. I have a daughter in her 2nd year of she stopped. I know you have a daughter, Elowyn said. The room was quiet. I'm sorry, Maribel said. And she meant it, that much was clear. painfully clear, the specific quality of an apology from someone who has been carrying the weight of a thing for long enough that sorry has become the truest word they know. Elowyn, I am genuinely, completely sorry. Elowyn looked at her for a long moment. I believe you, she said. Then I believe you're sorry, Elowyn said carefully. That doesn't change what you did. It doesn't undo the deletion, and it doesn't change the 6 years, and it doesn't fix the fact that you sat across from me 4 days ago and told me to be careful when what you actually knew was that you'd been helping them for years. She paused. Those are two separate things. You can be genuinely sorry and still have to account for what you did. Maribel's eyes were wet. She didn't try to hide it. I know, she said. Then here's what happens next, Elowyn said. You're going to write down everything. Everything you know about the arrangement, every instruction you received, every file you modified or deleted, every conversation with Corvin or anyone acting on his behalf. You're going to write it down, and you're going to give it to me, and then you're going to cooperate fully with any investigation that follows. If I do that, if you don't, Elowyn said, then when this comes apart, and it is coming apart, Maribel, that I can promise you you'll be on the wrong side of it with nothing to offer and everything to lose. If you cooperate now, that's a fact investigators will have to weigh. She moved toward the door. You have until tomorrow morning, she said. Write it down. She left. She made it to the stairwell before the steadiness she'd maintained in that office began to crack. Not dramatically, not with the kind of visible collapse she would have judged herself for, but in the small private way that things crack when you've been holding them together by force of concentration. She leaned against the stairwell wall for 40 seconds and breathed slowly and deliberately and did not think about the 11 months she'd spent building trust with Maribel Ashcombe. Did not think about the 3 times that trust had felt like something real. Did not think about the particular loneliness discovering that the person you'd most relied on in an institution had been working against you from before you arrived. Then she went back to work. Ronan was not a man who experienced fear cleanly. What he experienced instead was something that functioned like a heightened mechanical precision. His thinking getting faster and more specific, the unnecessary information dropping away, the variables that mattered rising to the surface with unusual clarity. Other men he'd known over the years described fear as something that slowed them down. For Ronan, it had always worked the opposite way. What was happening right now was faster than it should have been. He'd returned to the hospital to check on Bennett and found his brother sitting up in bed with more color in his face than he'd had in days. And something about the quality of Bennett's alertness, the way his eyes moved, when Ronan came through the door, the particular adjustment of his posture registered in Ronan's peripheral intelligence as a thing that required attention. You look better, Ronan said. Feel better, Bennett said. Doctors are talking about discharge, maybe Wednesday. Good. Ronan sat in the chair beside the bed, looked at his brother. Bennett was 31, 7 years younger, which had always felt like a larger gap when they were children, and had collapsed into almost nothing now that they were both adults. He had their mother's eyes lighter than Ronan's, easier to read, and a quality of restlessness that had always expressed itself in movement, in plans, in the particular energy of a person who was never quite satisfied with where things were. It was that restlessness that had worried Ronan occasionally over the past year. Who have you been talking to? Ronan asked. Bennett blinked. What? While you've been here, who have you been talking to outside the hospital? Ronan, I've been in a cardiac ward. You have a phone, Ronan said. You've had it since day 2. Who have you been calling? The adjustment was small, the kind of thing most people would miss. Bennett's hands resting on the blanket shifted slightly, not reaching for anything, just moving, the involuntary expression of a body reacting faster than the mind has decided on a story. I've called the office, Bennett said. Marcus, to handle the... Marcus called me 2 days ago, Ronan said quietly. He said he hadn't heard from you in a week. The room was very still. Bennett looked at his brother. How long? Ronan said. His voice was even, completely even. The kind of evenness that costs something to maintain. How long have you been talking? To Corvin. Whatever Bennett had been preparing to say, the architecture of the explanation he'd been building, the version of events that led somewhere survivable, it collapsed. Not slowly, not with any particular dignity, just a face going from one thing to another in the space of a breath. 8 months, he said. The number sat in the room. 8 months was before Bennett's cardiac episode. It was before the hospital. It was before Ronan had been at Blackridge at all, before the corridor, before Elowyn, before any of the events that Ronan had imagined up until this precise moment were connected to each other only through the accidents of proximity. The cardiac episode, Ronan said. Bennett didn't look away. She heard of Elsie, what was in. And in this moment, Ronan was working to locate the person he'd known for 31 years inside the person currently sitting in this hospital bed. He was apparently not someone who was going to look away. I induced it, Bennett said. Corvin has a doctor. It was survivable. It was designed to be survivable. You induced a cardiac episode to get you here. To get you into Blackridge specifically, while Corvin's people had access to the building, so they could. He stopped. So they could what? Ronan said. Map your movements. Understand your schedule. Ronan, he needed to know how you operated before he could. Before he could what? Ronan said again. And this time his voice had changed in the specific way that it changed when he'd asked a question twice and expected the answer delivered without further arrangement. Bennett exhaled. Make a move on the organization. Ronan sat with that. 8 months of information flowing from his brother to Thaddeus Corvin. 8 months of the man who'd grown up beside him, who knew the organization's structure from the inside in the way that only family knew it. Feeding that knowledge to the person who was currently building an operation inside Ronan's territory and planning to expand it. He didn't reach for anger. Anger was what Bennett would be expecting: the explosion, the confrontation, the moment that confirmed every calculation Bennett had made about how Ronan would react. He didn't give it. Why? He said simply, and Bennett told him. It took 11 minutes. Ronan listened without interrupting, which was harder than any other thing he'd done that week, because the specific content of what Bennett was saying required him to sit with accusations he couldn't immediately refute about control. A sound like protection had always contained a second element that protection wasn't supposed to contain, about decisions made on Bennett's behalf that had never involved Bennett, about a life that had been, for as long as Bennett could remember, managed by his older brother with the specific thoroughness of a man who loved people by keeping them in configurations he could monitor. You don't know how to love someone without keeping them, Bennett said. You never have. Every person in your life who matters to you is in a position you put them in. Marcus, the whole organization, me, you protect us until there's no difference between protection and a cage, and you don't even know you're doing it. The words were delivered with the clarity of something said after long thought, rehearsed not in the cynical sense, but in the way that people rehearse the things they've needed to say for years and have never found the opening. Ronan looked at his brother. He did not tell him he was wrong, because the honest accounting of what Bennett had described, stripped of the context of the betrayal, stripped of Corvin's involvement, reduced to its most basic claim, was not entirely inaccurate. You went to Corvin, Ronan said finally, a man who runs a criminal enterprise, to get out from under me. I went to someone who could make you stop controlling me, Bennett said. I didn't know what he was going to do with what I gave him. That's not a defense. I know. Ronan stood. He stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the same city that Elowyn had looked at from the rooftop the night before, and he let himself feel what he felt, which was the particular devastation of a betrayal that is partly your own fault, not entirely your fault, not in any way that transfers responsibility for the choice, but partly yours in the specific way that forces you to look at the pattern you've made rather than simply the person who exploited it. What happens now? Bennett asked. His voice was smaller. Ronan turned. I don't know yet, he said. He left the room. He told Elowyn that night. She was in the cafeteria again, late, the only customer left, eating a sandwich that she'd clearly purchased out of obligation to her own body rather than any interest in food. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been running on concentration and has used up more than their reserve without acknowledging it. He sat across from her. She looked up. Read his face. Tell me, she said, he told her. All of it, Bennett's 8 months, the cardiac episode, and what it had actually been. The information his brother had been feeding Corvin about the Halewick organization. The reason. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she set down her sandwich. "He's not wrong," she said. "Your brother." Ronan looked at her. "About the control," she said. "He's not completely wrong." "I know. You knew before I said it." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. There was nothing in her expression that softened the assessment, no concession toward being easier on him, and he found in a way that surprised him that he didn't want her to be easier on him. He wanted exactly what she was giving him, which was the truth delivered without the extra layer of management that people instinctively applied when the truth was going to hurt someone they cared about. He understood in that moment why he'd stayed 6 hours. "What are you going to do about him?" she asked. Ronan had been turning that question over since he'd left room 412 2 hours ago. "I don't know," he said, which was the honest answer, and the one that cost him the most to give, because not knowing was a state Ronan Halewick had trained himself out of over decades, and sitting inside it now felt like standing on a floor he wasn't sure would hold. "Yes, you do," Elowyn said. He looked at her. "You already know what the right thing is," she said. "You're just deciding whether you can do it." She picked up her sandwich and took a bite and didn't push further, and that restraint, the specific restraint of not pushing, of giving him the space to get there himself, was something he recognized as the most useful thing anyone had done for him in a very long time. He sat with it. Outside the cafeteria windows, Chicago was doing what it did at night, lit and cold and moving in all directions at once, a city that had never once waited for anyone to decide what they were doing. The following morning came in hard. Ronan was in the hotel where his security team had taken up 2 floors when his phone rang at 6:12, and the voice on the other end belonged to a man he trusted completely, delivering information in the clipped, careful manner of someone who understood that how a thing was said mattered almost as much as what was being said. Corvin had made his decision. He was not dismantling. He was not retreating. He had received Ronan's assessment of the situation passed through channels, deliberately, so there would be no ambiguity about whether the message had arrived, and his response had not been capitulation or even negotiation. His response had been to move. In the 18 hours since Ronan's implicit ultimatum had reached him, Corvin had made 6 calls to people inside city government, recalled 2 favors from a federal contact, and put 3 additional security personnel into Blackridge under cover of administrative staff roles. Elowyn had been followed home the previous night. 2 men. Professional. They'd stayed half a block back, rotated positions, done everything correctly, which meant they weren't amateurs and weren't simply trying to frighten her. They were establishing pattern of life, learning her route, her timing, the variables of her daily movement. Ronan ended the call. He made 3 calls of his own in rapid succession, each one short, each one precise. By the time he was finished, 2 of his own people were already repositioning toward Elowyn's likely route to the hospital. Then he called her. She picked up on the second ring. "Don't go home the usual way tonight," he said. A short silence. "How many 2? Following you home last night. Their building pattern." Another silence, this one with a different quality, not fear, but the sound of someone reorganizing their internal map very quickly. "All right," she said. "I can have people. I'll pick the hotel," she said. "You can put security outside, but I pick it." Agreed. He heard her exhale not with relief, but with the specific breath of someone who has crossed a line in their own mind and is acknowledging what's on the other side of it. Because that was what this was. Corvin's decision to move rather than retreat had transformed the situation from a complex institutional conflict into something with edges. Real edges. The kind that drew blood. Elowyn knew it too. "He's not going to let this go," she said. "Not a question." "No, and you told him to shut it down." "Yes." And he said no. Not in those words, but yes. She was quiet for a moment. "Ronan," she said, "yes. There's no version of the next few weeks where this stays manageable, is there?" He considered giving her a softer answer. He considered the specific mercy of the edited truth, the version of events that contained the important facts, arranged in an order that made them easier to absorb. He had agreed not to do that, No, he said. There isn't. She hung up. She went back inside the hospital and picked up her charts and started rounds. And she moved through the wing with the particular controlled focus of a woman who has just been told that the situation she is inside has gotten significantly more dangerous and has decided that the response to that information is to be better at her job than she has ever been before, because the one thing Thaddeus Corvin and Preston Vale and every person who had worked to undermine her investigation could not take from her was the work itself. The actual irreducible fact of what she did in these rooms with these patients, and nobody was going to find her cowering in a corner when this came to its end. She was 20 minutes into rounds when her pager went off. Not a patient emergency. A code she recognized from the internal communication system, the one that indicated a security situation in the administrative wing. Then her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize that contained 4 words and nothing else. They found the backup. Elowyn stopped in the middle of the corridor. Not the primary backup she had that with her, on an encrypted drive that hadn't left her person since she'd restructured her security 2 weeks ago, but the secondary location, the one she'd stored off-site as a redundancy, in a place she'd considered secure, with a person she'd trusted enough to ask. She stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. Then she understood with a clarity that was almost physical in its weight, that there were exactly 2 people outside this hospital who knew the location of that secondary backup. Maribel Ashcombe was one of them, and Maribel had not yet written down what Elowyn had asked for. She turned and walked back toward the nursing station. She moved at a pace that looked, to anyone watching, like purposeful professional movement, and was in fact something very close to the controlled edge of a person who has just understood that the betrayal she thought she'd already survived had a second layer she hadn't seen yet, and that the woman she'd sat across from yesterday and offered a path towards something survivable had chosen, in the hours since, a different direction entirely. She didn't run, but she walked like a woman who was out of time. Elowyn reached the 2nd floor in 4 minutes. She knew the exact layout of Blackridge's administrative wing, the way she knew the layout of every space she'd worked in for more than 6 months. Not because she'd memorized it deliberately, but because she was the kind of person who registered exits and camera positions and blind spots, the way other people registered furniture, as background information that occasionally became relevant. She'd spent 11 months in this building. She knew where the cameras were. She knew which offices had internal windows and which ones had solid walls. She knew that Maribel Ashcombe's office had both a primary door facing the main administrative corridor and a secondary access through the filing room that most people forgot existed because it was usually locked, and covered by a shelving unit on the interior side. She didn't go to the primary door. She went to the filing room. The secondary door was unlocked. It was unlocked because Maribel used it when she didn't want to be seen moving between spaces, a habit Elowyn had noticed 8 months ago and filed away with the particular instinct of who collect small observations and never quite threw them out. She pushed through slowly. The shelving unit had been moved. Recently, the floor showed drag marks in the dust that were less than a day old. The door to Maribel's office was open 6 inches. Elowyn stopped. She could hear voices, not arguing worse than arguing. The controlled low-register exchange of 2 people who have already moved past the argument into the part where decisions get made. She recognized Maribel's voice immediately. The other voice was male, measured with the specific cadence of someone accustomed to giving instructions rather than requests. She did not recognize it. She stood completely still and listened. "The drive," the male voice said. "You told him you didn't know where she kept it." "I don't know where she keeps the primary," Maribel said. Her voice was strained, not frightened exactly, but tight in the way of someone managing something very heavy. "The secondary's location I gave you was everything I knew. If she's moved it, she's moved it." A pause. "How do you know?" "Because the location you gave us was empty," the man said. "She cleared it sometime in the last 48 hours. Which means she knew we were coming. Which means a pause that carried considerable weight. Which means she was told." Elowyn's jaw tightened. She had not moved the secondary backup in the last 48 hours. She had moved it 10 days ago when she'd restructured her security after the locker search. Maribel had been given an outdated location, not deliberately, not as a trap, but simply because Elowyn had updated her storage protocol and hadn't circled back to inform anyone. A coincidence that had just saved her. It doesn't matter, Maribel said. Even without the backup, it matters considerably, the man said. Mr. Corvin's position is that the primary complaint documentation, if it reaches external investigators with the backup intact, creates a prosecutable case. Without the backup, the complaint is substantial but arguable. With it, he left the sentence unfinished in the way that people leave sentences unfinished when the conclusion is obvious to everyone in the room. I've done everything he asked, Maribel said. And beneath the strain in her voice, beneath the tightness, something else was present now. Something that sounded less like cooperation and more like the very end of a person's capacity to continue being the thing they've been forced to be. I deleted the files. I gave you the location. I've been in this for 6 years, and I want what you want, the man said, is not a variable, Mr. Corvin factors into his decisions. Silence. There's one more thing, he said. Ms. Mercer met with someone on the roof 2 evenings ago. We have it on camera, the exterior exit camera, not the roof itself, so we have entry and exit times, but not the conversation. Who was she meeting? Maribel said nothing. Dr. Ashcombe. I don't know, Maribel said. You have 11 years of relationships in this building. You know everyone who comes and goes with any regularity. A man late 30s, dark coat, came through the roof access at 6:43 and left at 7:31. Ms. Mercer entered at 6:47 and left at 7:28. You're telling me you have no information on who that is? Another silence, this one longer. No, Maribel said finally. I don't know who that is. She was lying. Elowyn couldn't tell if Maribel knew she was lying convincingly or if she simply didn't care anymore. But the lie was there, delivered flatly, and the man on the other side of accepted it in the specific way of someone who doesn't believe it, but doesn't yet have a use for the argument. Mr. Corvin will be in contact, he said. In the meantime, your cooperation is noted and expected to continue. Footsteps. Elowyn pulled back from the door and moved 3 steps deeper into the filing room and pressed herself against the shelving unit as the office door opened fully and someone walked through and out into the corridor. She heard the corridor door close. She stood in the dark of the filing room and breathed. Then she pushed back through to the office. Maribel was sitting at her desk, with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes closed, and the expression of a person who has just finished a conversation that cost them something they'll never entirely get back. She opened her eyes when Elowyn came through the door. She didn't look surprised. She looked, if anything, slightly relieved, which was its own particular kind of complicated. How much did you hear? Maribel said. Enough. Maribel nodded. Looked down at her hands. The location I gave you, Elowyn said. How long ago did you give it to them? Yesterday evening, Maribel said. After you left my office. Elowyn took that in. You called them as soon as I left. Yes. There was a silence that had a very specific texture, not the silence of 2 people who have nothing to say, green wood splitting, but the silence of 2 people where one of them is working through what the other one's choices have actually cost, and the other one has already done that accounting and is now simply waiting for the bill to arrive. The man who was just here, Elowyn said. Who is he? I don't know his name. He works for Corvin directly. He's been the contact for the last 2 years. What does he know about my investigation? Everything I know. Maribel's voice was flat. Which is everything you showed me in this office. The billing structure, the patient selection pattern, veils the estimated annual figure. Does he know about the external submissions? Yes. The regulatory bodies I submitted to outside the hospital? Yes. Elowyn stood very still for a moment. Then he's already working to suppress them, she said. Probably, Maribel said. Corvin has contacts in 2 of the 3 regulatory structures you would have used. I don't know which bodies you submitted to specifically, but it doesn't matter which ones. Elowyn moved to the window. Not to look out to put something solid between her back and the door. Old instinct, recently acquired. If he has contacts there, the submissions are already compromised or will be shortly. She thought about the 6 weeks of work that had gone into those submissions. The specific, painstaking construction of a complaint detailed enough to survive institutional resistance, duplicated across 3 separate bodies so that suppressing one didn't eliminate the others. She had built it to be resilient. She had believed it was resilient. She hadn't accounted for Corvin's reach extending that far. "How long has he had contacts inside regulatory structures?" she said. "At least 3 years, Maribel said. That's when I became aware of it. 3 years. 3 years of a man quietly building institutional protection that extended not just through Blackridge, but through the bodies designed to oversee institutions like Blackridge. The scope of it, the patience, the systematic investment in compromised relationships, was larger than anything she'd mapped in 11 months of investigation. She had built her case on the assumption that the institutions she was submitting to were functional. That the oversight structure, imperfect as it always was at least nominally intact. It wasn't. She didn't let herself feel the full weight of that yet, because feeling the full weight of something is a luxury that belongs to moments of safety, and she was not in a moment of safety. "Maribel," she said, "the offer I made you yesterday. Cooperate fully, document everything, give investigators what they need. It still stands." Maribel looked at her. "After what I don't have the time or the interest in being angry at you right now," Elowyn said. "What I need is everything you know about Corvin's external contacts. Every name, every relationship, every structure you're aware of. Because the case I built assumed the oversight system worked, and it doesn't. And I need to rebuild from a different foundation, and I need to do it fast. If Corvin finds out I've given you that, he already thinks you're cooperating with him," Elowyn said. "That gives you a window. Use it." Maribel looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out a notepad. Elowyn called Ronan from the stairwell. A sound like green wood splitting. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he'd been waiting for her to call, which told her he'd already received some version of what she was about to tell him. "How much do you know?" she said. The secondary location was accessed. The backup wasn't there. "Corvin has contacts inside the regulatory bodies I submitted to. At least 2 of the 3. A pause, brief but present. "How long?" he said. 3 years confirmed. Possibly longer." Another pause. This one with a different quality, the sound of someone reorganizing a significant structure in real time. "That changes the approach," he said. "That demolishes the approach," she said. "I spent 11 months building a case designed to move through institutional channels. If the channels are compromised, then the case needs different channels. I'm aware of that," she said. "What I don't have is a clear picture of which channels aren't compromised. Maribel is giving me names, but I need your people to cross-reference them against what you know about Corvin's network. Send me what she gives you, Ronan." She stopped, made herself say the next part carefully. "If the regulatory submissions are killed, the case against Vale may also be compromised. The assault charge, the fractured documentation that goes to a different system. But if Corvin has the kind of reach Maribel is describing, there's no guarantee the criminal complaint survives either." The line was quiet for a moment. "Come to the hotel," he said. "I have 4 hours left on shift." Elowyn. "I have 4 hours left on shift," she said again evenly. "I'll come after." She hung up. She went back to her patients. She moved through the remaining 4 hours of her shift with a focus so concentrated it was almost physical, a deliberate, sustained act of attention to the people in her care that served the double function of being genuinely necessary and providing the only reliable anchor to something stable in a situation that had become, in the course of a single morning, significantly less stable than she'd believed it was. She checked medications. She updated records. She sat with a 72-year-old woman named Geraldine, who was scared about her procedure the following morning and held her hand for 11 minutes and listened with actual attention, because Geraldine was scared and deserved actual attention, and because Elowyn Mercer had not yet become the kind of person who let an institutional crisis reduce the quality of what she gave to the people in these beds. She would not become that person. At the end of her shift, she changed out of her scrubs in a bathroom stall, put on the clothes against she'd started carrying in her bag 2 weeks ago, as a habit against exactly this kind of situation. and left through the East Wing exit rather than the main entrance. She took a cab to a hotel 12 blocks from the one Ronan was staying at, checked in under a name attached to a credit card she'd opened 18 months ago, for reasons she'd been unable to articulate at the time, but now seemed moderately prescient, and then called Ronan with the address of a coffee shop equidistant between the two hotels. He arrived 7 minutes after she did. He looked at her face when he sat down and didn't ask how she was, which she appreciated, because how she was obvious, and she didn't have patience for the ritual of answering that question honestly right now. She gave him everything Maribel had given her: the names, the relationships, the structural description of Corvin's external network, as Maribel understood it. He read through it twice. 3 of these names I can confirm, he said. 2 I hadn't connected to Corvin specifically. 1 is a surprise. Which one? He pointed to a name on the list. Elowyn looked at it. He's on the Federal Oversight Committee. Yes. For healthcare fraud specifically. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. The particular bleakness of it, the specific targeted irony of the person whose job was to investigate healthcare fraud, being in the pocket of the person committing it, was almost architectural in its completeness. Corvin hadn't just built a fraud operation. He'd built a protection structure, the fraud operation that nested inside the oversight structure itself, so that the act of trying to report the fraud activated the very machinery he controlled. How, she said. How has this been operational for 4 years without? Because the people inside it benefit from it staying operational, Ronan said. And the people outside it don't know it exists. That's how these things work. It's not complicated. It's just patient. I spent 11 months, she said. I know. Building something specifically designed to move through those channels. I know. And the channels were Elowyn. His voice was quiet. Not soft quiet, which was different. You didn't know. You built the best case you could with the information you had. That's not a failure. It's a starting point. She looked at him. The starting point involves my primary complaint documentation being in the hands of a regulatory body that Corvin controls, she said. It involves 11 months of documented evidence potentially being used against me by the person it was designed to expose. It involves the backup being compromised in location, if not yet in content, and my professional contacts inside this hospital being reduced to one woman who has been working against me for 6 years and has now decided, possibly, to change sides at the moment when it's least certain to help. She stopped. That's the starting point, she said. Ronan looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. That's the starting point. Something about the simple confirmation of it, no minimizing, no reframing. Just the acknowledgement of the exact shape of the problem broke something loose in her chest that she'd been holding in place by force of concentration for the last 6 hours. Not tears. Nothing as simple as tears. Just a moment of letting the actual weight of it be its actual weight without managing the response. She breathed. Then she set her hands flat on the table. New approach, she said. Talk to me. Ronan had people who specialized in the specific problem of corrupted oversight structures. This was not, he explained, because he had anticipated Elowyn's particular situation, but because the problem of institutional capture, regulatory bodies and legal structures controlled by the people they were meant to regulate, was a problem his own organization encountered regularly and had developed tools for addressing. The tools were not in every case legal. He said this clearly, and she received it clearly, and they had a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and was, in its way, the most honest extended exchange she'd had in the entire 11 months of the investigation. The core of it was this: the case against Corvin, Vale, and the Blackridge operation was not destroyed. It was redirected. The institutional channels that Corvin controlled could not be used, but they could be bypassed, not through Ronan's organization acting directly, which would compromise the case in different and equally serious ways, but through a specific combination of journalistic exposure, federal jurisdiction outside the compromise bodies, and the particular leverage that came from demonstrating publicly that the oversight structure itself had been corrupted. It's a bigger target, Elowyn said. Yes, we're not just exposing the fraud. We're exposing the protection structure. Yes, which means Corvin has more to lose. Significantly more, which means he'll move harder. Yes, Ronan said. He will. She thought about the two men following her home. Pattern of life surveillance, the professionalism of it, the patience. He's already moving, she said. He made the decision to move 2 days ago, Ronan said, when I delivered my assessment of the situation, and he chose war instead of retreat. Everything since then has been him executing that decision. She looked at him. You gave him an ultimatum. I told him the situation clearly and indicated the consequences of continuing. And he said no. He said no. And now his people are following me home and accessing secondary backup locations and working through compromised regulators to kill my submissions. Yes. And you're telling me about this now, she said carefully, because you're also moving. Ronan didn't look away. Yes. What are you doing? He told her. The detail of it was, in its way, impressive, not the criminal elements, which she received without comment as the operational context they were, but the structural intelligence. The way Ronan understood Corvin's organization, not just as a set of relationships, but as a system with specific load-bearing points, specific dependencies, specific vulnerabilities that came from the same source as its strengths. Corvin's power came from his institutional penetration, which meant his vulnerability was the institutions, which meant the move was not to fight him directly, but to remove the institutional foundation and let the structure collapse on its own weight. You've been planning this since the rooftop, she said. Since before the rooftop, he said. Since Bennett. She registered what he was not saying, that his brother's betrayal had given him something he hadn't had before, which was a complete map of what Corvin knew about the Halewick organization, and therefore a clear picture of what Corvin thought he was dealing with. He thinks he understands your operation, she said. He thinks he knows its capabilities and its limits, Ronan said. He doesn't. What Bennett gave him was accurate as of 8 months ago. The organization has changed since then. Corvin is making decisions based on a picture of something that no longer quite exists. And you let him. I haven't corrected him, Ronan said, which is a different thing. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold while they talked. I need 48 hours, she said, to rebuild the submission structure outside the compromised channels. You have it. And I need your people's cross-referenced list of Corvin's external contacts. Everyone you can confirm. Because the new approach requires demonstrating the corruption of the oversight structure. And to demonstrate it, I need to document it. And to document it, I need names that can be independently verified. I'll have it by morning. She nodded, stood, put on her coat. Ronan, she said. He looked up Bennett. She said the name carefully, aware of the weight it carried for him right now. What are you going to do? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet, he said. Yes, you do, she said, which was what she'd said to him the night before. And the repetition of it was deliberate, not cruel, but the specific kind of mirror that she'd decided he needed, and had decided she was willing to hold up. He looked at her. I'm working on being able to do it, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her yet, and she recognized it as such, and she didn't push further. She left. The following morning arrived like a problem that had been waiting overnight to be fully formed. Elowyn was in the hotel room she'd taken under a different name, working through the reconstructed submission framework on a laptop she'd purchased for cash 3 days ago and not connected to any network she'd used before, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, her phone buzzed with a text from Ronan's number. Pick up if they call again. It's safe. It rang again 2 minutes later. She picked up. The voice on the other end was a woman. Professional cadence, slightly clipped, the particular vocal quality of someone accustomed to delivering information in conditions where time was a resource. Ms. Mercer. My name is Agent Dana Foro. I'm with a federal financial crimes unit that operates outside the 3 regulatory bodies you submitted your complaint to. I've been given your contact by a source I'm not at liberty to name. I'd like to meet. Elowyn sat very still when she said, Today, if possible. There are some developments in your case that require your attention rather urgently. What kind of developments? The kind that are better discussed in person, Foro said. Ms. Mercer, I want to be direct with you. 2 of the regulatory submissions you made have been intercepted and are being reviewed by individuals with a direct conflict of interest. We're aware of this. We've been aware of the broader operation for approximately 7 months. Your documentation has given us something we didn't have. What did it give you? The patient-level records, Foro said. The billing discrepancy pattern. The clinical documentation that establishes, in detail, exactly how the procedure coding was manipulated. We had the financial architecture. We didn't have the clinical mechanism. You've provided the clinical mechanism. Elowyn's grip on the phone tightened. You've been investigating Corvin for 7 months, she said. Yes, and you didn't. She stopped. Chose the next words carefully. Did you know about the assault on a staff member 6 weeks ago? A brief pause. We became aware of it, Foro said. The heat that moved through Elowyn's chest in that moment was specific and thorough. 7 months of federal investigation, an assault that had broken her arm in front of 37 witnesses. And the people who'd known about Corvin's operation had registered that assault as a data point, as a development, as something they'd become aware of, and had continued their investigation without making contact. You let it happen, she said. Miss Mercer. My arm was broken in a hospital corridor, Elowyn said. Her voice was absolutely flat, in front of 37 people, and you became aware of it. The pause was longer this time. The decision to delay contact was made at a level above my authority, Foro said. I'm telling you this because I think you deserve honesty about the process, and because I am asking for your help, and asking for help while being dishonest about what we've allowed to happen would be worse than useless. I'm sorry for what you went through. I am also asking you right now to help us finish this. Elowyn sat with the apology for approximately 3 seconds. Where? She said. The meeting was in a building Elowyn didn't know, on a floor that had the specific character of a space that was being used for a purpose. It wasn't designed for temporary equipment. Too many people for the square footage, the focused hum of an operation running at pace. Foro was exactly what her voice suggested. Mid-40s. Efficient. A face that had learned to deliver difficult information without editorializing it. There were 3 other people in the room. One of them, Elowyn noticed, was looking at a file that contained what appeared to be surveillance photographs of the Blackridge administrative wing. Foro gave her the overview in 15 minutes. The federal investigation had been built on the financial side, transaction tracing, shell companies, the offshore architecture that moved Corvin's $40 million annually through a series of structures designed to look like legitimate healthcare investment funds. They had it documented. They had it documented well. What they hadn't been able to establish was the clinical mechanism, the specific patient-level evidence of how the fraudulent billing was generated at the point of care. Without that, the case was strong but arguable. With it, with Elowyn's 11 months of clinical documentation, it became something different. Something prosecutable, Elowyn said. Something iron, Foro said. Your clinical records, cross-referenced against the billing data we've accumulated, creates a complete picture. Fraud generated at the bedside, moved through administrative coding, extracted through financial structures we can trace to Corvin specifically. Every link in the chain documented, and the compromised regulators. Foro nodded. That's the second case, which frankly may have more long-term significance than the fraud case itself. Demonstrating institutional capture at the oversight level. You need Marable, Elowyn said. Foro looked at her. She has 6 years of direct contact with Corvin's operation, Elowyn said. She knows the names, the structure, the specific instructions she received, and from whom. She can testify to the mechanism of coercion, how Corvin converts financial leverage into operational compliance. If you want to make the institutional capture case, she's the most direct witness you have. Is she willing to cooperate? She was as of yesterday morning. Elowyn paused. She may have changed her assessment since then. She's been under pressure in both directions. Can you get to her? Elowyn thought about the secondary door. The filing room, the drag marks in the dust. Yes, she said. Foro leaned forward. Miss Mercer, I want to be honest about the timeline. Corvin is aware that something has shifted. His external contacts have been less responsive in the last 48 hours than they typically are, which suggests he's uncertain about the stability of his protection structure. When a man like Corvin becomes uncertain, he either retreats or accelerates. Based on what we know of him, he accelerates, Elowyn said. Yes. So, we have a window. A narrow one. Elowyn looked at the surveillance photographs on the table across the room. She looked at the wall of transaction records behind Foro. She looked at the 3 people in the room who had for 7 months been building a case around the outside of the same building. She'd been building one from the inside. She thought about 11 months. She thought about a notebook full of handwritten observations and a cast on her arm and a digital backup she'd been moving between locations for 6 weeks, and a woman who had sat across from her in a well-lit office and apologized with complete sincerity and then called Corvin's contact the moment she left. She thought about Ronan on the rooftop, telling her without apology who he was. She thought about Bennett in room 412, saying the truest thing he'd probably ever said to his brother. She thought about 37 people standing in a corridor, doing nothing. Tell me what you need, she said. Foro opened a folder. And in the fluorescent hum of that temporary room, with Chicago pressing against the windows outside, and a narrow window of time narrowing further by the hour, Elowyn Mercer stopped building a case that designed to move through a system that had already failed her and started building something different, something designed not to survive the system, but to replace it. At least in this one specific instance, with something that worked. She worked through the night. By morning, she had rebuilt everything. By morning, the window was still open, but barely. She was pulling on her coat to leave when her phone buzzed with a text from Ronan. 3 words. Corvin knows Foro. She stared at the screen. A second text arrived, 10 seconds later, and this one was longer, and the information it contained was the kind that arrived like a physical impact, not loud, not dramatic, just the specific, bone-deep shock of understanding that the ground you were standing on had been compromised from a direction you hadn't been watching. Foro's unit had a leak. The meeting location had been reported to Corvin's network within 2 hours of their arrival, which meant Corvin now knew that the federal case existed, knew that Elowyn had connected with it, knew the approximate scope of the documentation she'd provided, and had between that moment and whatever came next to decide what to do with all of it. Elowyn stood in the doorway of the temporary office, with her phone in her hand and the coat half on and the full weight of what had just collapsed, landing across the architecture of everything she'd spent the night rebuilding. The case was still intact, but the people building it had been seen. And Thaddeus Corvin, who had chosen war over retreat, who had chosen acceleration over withdrawal, who had spent 4 years building a protection structure specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of exposure, now knew exactly where they were standing. Elowyn sent 3 texts in 90 seconds. The first was to Foro, compromised. Do not move anything until you hear from me. The second was to Ronan. How long ago did you find out? The third was to Maribel. Do not go to your office. Go somewhere public and stay there. I'll explain. Then she put the phone in her coat pocket, finished putting on the coat, and stood in the doorway of the compromised room, looking at the people inside it who didn't yet know they were compromised. Foro was at the far table reviewing transaction records with one of her team. The other 2 were at separate workstations. Nobody was looking at her. Foro, she said. The agent looked up. We have a problem, Elowyn said. She said it the way you say a thing when there isn't time to say it gently, and gentle wouldn't help anyway. Flat, direct, and fast. Because the window was narrow and getting narrower, and the specific luxury of processing shock was not available to anyone in this room right now. Foro went still. The team around her did not go still. They moved, pulling hardware, closing files, the practiced rapid compression of an operation that had drills for exactly this situation. The efficiency of it would have impressed Elowyn under other circumstances. Source, Foro said, independent, credible. Corvin was informed of this location within 2 hours of our arrival. Who knew the location? Everyone in this room. Elowyn looked at the 3 other people. And whoever scheduled the facility. Foro's jaw tightened. She turned to the person nearest her, a man in his 30s, with a look on his face that was doing the work of staying neutral in a situation where neutral was extremely difficult to maintain. Hendricks, facility access. 3 people outside the unit, he said. Logistics coordinator, building security, the scheduling supervisor. Get me all 3 in the next 10 minutes. She turned back to Elowyn. Your documentation, she said. Where is it? Not here, Elowyn said. Was never here. Foro looked at her with an expression that contained several things at once: reassessment, something close to respect, a sound like green wood splitting, and the particular controlled frustration of a professional who has just been reminded that the person across from her had been operating in hostile conditions considerably longer than the last 12 hours. Ronan's phone buzzed before mine, Elowyn said. He has a source. I don't know who. What matters is we have maybe a few hours before Corvin decides what to do with what he knows. He won't move against a federal operation. He won't move against it directly, Elowyn said. He'll move against its evidence, against its witnesses, against the people whose testimony holds it together. She paused. Against me. Faro was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Where are you going? She said. Back to the hospital. That's the least safe location you could. Maribel is there, Elowyn said. And she's the connective tissue between your financial case and the institutional capture case. If Corvin's people reach her before we get her formal cooperation documented and submitted, she either disappears or recants, and you lose the best witness you have to the coercion mechanism. Foro looked at her. I'm sending someone with you, she said. Fine, Elowyn said. Make it someone you're certain about. She was out the door before Foro finished the sentence. Ronan called before she reached the elevator. How much time? She said. I don't know. My source inside Corvin's operation says he called a meeting this morning. That means he's moved from planning to execution. When Corvin calls a meeting, things happen within hours. I need Maribel secured and her statement formally documented in the next 3 hours. Where are you? She told him. I'll have 2 people there in 8 minutes, he said. Don't wait for them. Start moving, Ronan. I know, he said. Stay in public spaces. Don't use the main hospital entrance. I know you know, he said. I'm saying it because saying it is the only useful thing I can do right now, and I need to do something useful. She got into the elevator. 8 minutes, she said, and hung up. The agent Foro sent was a woman named Carver, who moved like someone who'd done protective detail before and didn't feel the need to discuss it. She fell into step beside Elowyn on the sidewalk without preamble, which Elowyn appreciated, and they moved the 6 blocks to Blackridge at a pace that was not quite running, but covered ground quickly. Chicago in the early morning was raw and gray, and full of people who had somewhere to be and no interest in anyone else's problems. Elowyn felt the cold through her coat and the particular sharpness of a night without sleep and the specific focused alertness that the body produces in genuine danger, not adrenaline panic, but something older and more useful, the kind of awareness that makes everything slightly more vivid, that registers the man in the dark coat on the opposite sidewalk 2 full seconds before the conscious mind has decided to notice him. She noticed him. He was not moving toward her. He was standing. Watching. She kept her pace exactly even and said quietly, without turning her head, Man in a dark coat. Across the street. 11 o'clock. Got him, Carver said. Same volume. Keep moving. Is he Corvin's? Don't know yet. They kept moving. He didn't follow. But that didn't mean he wasn't calling someone who would. Maribel was in the hospital cafeteria. She was sitting at a corner table with a coffee she hadn't touched, and her hands folded on the surface, and the look of a woman who has been waiting in a state of controlled dread for long enough that the dread has begun to show in the set of her shoulders and the angle of her jaw. She looked up when Elowyn came through the door, and something in her face shifted, not relief, exactly, but the specific reaction of someone who has been waiting for the worst, and seen instead something that is not yet the worst. Elowyn sat across from her. Carver took a position near the door without sitting, without making it obvious, with the practiced invisibility of someone who knew how to occupy space without drawing attention to it. How bad, Maribel said. Bad, Elowyn said. The federal meeting location was leaked. Corvin knows about the case. Maribel's face went through several things in rapid succession. Then you're only in more danger if you're still trying to serve both sides, Elowyn said. Corvin's protection for you evaporated the moment he found out about the federal case. Because the moment he goes down, and he is going down, Maribel, that hasn't changed anyone he's been protecting, becomes someone he's actively eliminating as a liability. You understand what that means. Maribel understood. The understanding moved through her face clearly and completely. I need your formal statement, Elowyn said. Not written in my office. Recorded, dated, witnessed by a federal agent, and submitted through a clean channel that Corvin cannot access. That statement is what keeps you on the right side of this, when it lands. When will it land? Hours, Elowyn said. Maybe less. Maribel looked at her hands. Her coffee had gone cold. She hadn't touched it. 6 years, she said, not asking for anything. Just stating it. I know, Elowyn said. I was a good nurse, Maribel said. Before all of this, I was genuinely good at it. I know that too, Elowyn said, and she meant it, which was the complicated part because Maribel had been good at it, and it was possible to hold that truth alongside the other truth, the 6 years of it, without one canceling the other. Both things were real. That was just what it was. All right, Maribel said. She stood. They used a conference room on the 4th floor that Elowyn had chosen for 3 specific reasons. It had no external windows. Its internal window faced a section of corridor that was not on the route Corvin's administrative staff used, and it had a secondary exit through a connecting hallway that most people in the building didn't know existed. Carver set up the recording on a secure device she'd been carrying. Ellison sat at the end of the table. Maribel sat in the center and folded her hands and began to talk. She talked for 47 minutes. The full account of 6 years of coercion was longer and more specific than anything Elowyn had anticipated. The initial arrangement, the way it had been transformed, gradually and systematically, from a financial relationship into leverage. The specific instructions Maribel had received about which records to modify, when and how. The names of every person she'd interacted with on Corvin's behalf. The dates and approximate contents of every significant communication. The name of the Federal Oversight Committee member who had been on Corvin's payroll for 3 years. The name of the logistics coordinator who had disclosed Foro's meeting location. Elowyn sat at the end of the table and listened and did not interrupt and took 3 pages of notes in handwriting she would later be able to read, and by the end of the 47 minutes, she had in her possession a form that was formally documented and witnessed and submitted through Carver's clean channel, complete account of the institutional capture mechanism that Corvin had built around his operation. It was in its way everything. It was also exactly what Corvin could not allow to reach any functioning part of the justice system, which meant they had been in this room for 47 minutes, and the window, already narrow, had been narrowing the entire time. Elowyn's phone buzzed. Ronan, they're in the building. She looked at Carver. We need to move, she said. The east stairwell was empty. They moved through it quickly, Elowyn first, then Maribel, then Carver at the rear, and the sound of their footsteps in the concrete stairwell had a specific quality, the echo of people moving with purpose in a space designed to amplify sound, and Elowyn registered every additional sound against that baseline, with the alertness of someone who has been awake for too long and afraid for long enough, that the fear has become a kind of precision instrument rather than a noise. 2 floors down, she heard a door above them open. She stopped. Maribel stopped behind her. Carver's hand went to her side. They listened. Footsteps descending. More than one person. The pace was deliberate, not running. Not the normal movement of hospital staff, but measured. Professional. The pace of people who were going somewhere specific and knew where that was. Elowyn looked at the door on the landing they were standing on. Floor 2. She knew this floor. She had worked on this floor for 18 months. She pushed through the door. The 3 of them came out into the 2nd floor corridor, and Elowyn turned left without hesitating because left led to the main nursing wing, and the main nursing wing was busy at this hour, full of staff and patients, and the organized, purposeful movement of a hospital at mid-morning, which was the only terrain on which Corvin's people couldn't move freely without drawing the wrong kind of attention. She was right. The corridor opened into the wing, and there were nurses and a resident she recognized, and 2 patients being moved in wheelchairs, and the specific organized chaos of a busy medical floor, and Elowyn walked into it like she belonged there, because she did belong there, had belonged there for 18 months, knew every person whose eyes tracked her she moved through. Behind her, she heard the stairwell door open. She didn't look back. She moved to the nursing station and leaned across the counter and said to the charge nurse on duty, a woman named Patricia, who had worked beside her for a year and knew her without needing context, "I need room 7, cleared for a procedure consultation." Now Patricia looked at her face and said, "It's clear already," without asking questions, which was one of the things Elowyn had always valued about her. She moved Maribel and Carver through. The door closed. She breathed. Ronan arrived at Blackridge 11 minutes later. She knew it was 11 minutes because she was tracking time the way she tracked vitals continuously, with the specific attention of someone for whom the interval between measurements carried clinical significance. He came through the secondary entrance with 2 people she'd never seen before, and Rumseen found her in the corridor outside room 7 and looked at her face the way she'd looked at Patricia's reading it without needing exposition. "Carver's channel," he said. "Did it go through?" "Yes." Before we moved from the conference room, something in his shoulders that had been held at a specific tension released a few degrees. "Then it's in," he said. "Corvin's people are in the building." "I know. 3 of them. Administrative cover. They came in through the main entrance 40 minutes ago, posing as a compliance inspection team." His jaw was tight. "They know about the conference room. We were already gone." "I know." He looked at her, the statement, Maribel's statement. "Is it complete?" "Complete and submitted, then the case." "The case is intact," she said. "For the first time since yesterday morning, the case is actually intact." He looked at her for a moment, just the specific beat of a person registering something they'd been working toward and hadn't allowed themselves to fully believe in until now. Then his phone buzzed. He read it. His expression changed. "What?" she said. "Vale," he said. "He's been moved. Someone inside the hospital just cleared him for an emergency administrative proceeding that doesn't exist. He's being moved through the system right now by people with credentials that are real but shouldn't be his." She stared at him. "They're not running," she said. "No. They're using the window to clean up," she said. "Asarvan's people are in the building. While there's still uncertainty about whether the case survives, they're moving Vale to a position where he can claim the assault complaint was resolved through internal channels." "Yes. If Vale processes through internal channels, the external criminal complaint gets complicated," Ronan said. "Not killed, but complicated. The kind of complicated that buys Corvin time." She was already moving. He fell into step beside her. "Where?" he said. "Wherever they're taking Vale," she said. "Because if he clears that process before Foro's team can establish independent jurisdiction over the assault charge, he buys a window and uses that window to—" "I know," Ronan said. They moved. The administrative proceeding was being held on the 5th floor, in a boardroom that Elowyn had been in exactly once before, when she'd first arrived at Blackridge and been given the orientation tour. It was a large room with a long table and floor-to-ceiling windows and the specific aesthetic of institutional power. Everything in it was designed to make the person who ran the meeting feel authoritative and the person being processed feel managed. Preston Vale was at the far end of the table. He looked different than he had in the corridor 6 weeks ago. The polished authority was there, the suit, the posture, the quality of self-certainty that some people carry like a structural feature rather than a choice, but something beneath it was different. Something in the set of his eyes, the specific tightness around the mouth. The self-certainty was still present, but it was being maintained now, which meant it wasn't entirely intact. Good. There were 4 other people in the room. 3 Elowyn didn't recognize. One she did, a man from hospital legal whom she'd seen in 2 previous administrative contexts, and who looked, when she came through the door, like someone who had been asked to run a process he was not entirely certain was legitimate and had made the calculation that the uncertainty wasn't his problem. Vale saw her, the room saw her. She walked to the end of the table and stood. This proceeding, she said, to no one person, specifically, which meant to everyone, is being used to internally resolve an external criminal complaint, which means everyone in this room is currently participating in an obstruction of an active federal investigation. The silence was the specific silence of a room full of people who have just heard something that rearranges their personal liability calculation. Ms. Mercer, the legal man said, "You're not party to this." "I'm the complainant," she said. "I'm the central party to this. And I'm telling you, formally and with a federal agent present," she gestured toward Carver, who had come through the door behind her and whose identification was already in her hand, that the assault charge against Preston Vale is within federal jurisdiction as part of an active investigation and cannot be processed through internal hospital channels. Carver held up her identification. The room was very still. Vale's face had gone through several things in rapid succession. She watched it happen: the confidence, the recalculation, the specific moment where a man understands that the architecture he built his safety on has developed a significant structural problem. He stood. "Sit down," Elowyn said. He sat down. She hadn't planned to say that. It had arrived without consultation from some part of her that had been waiting, across 6 weeks and a broken arm and 11 months and a hospital floor, to say exactly that to exactly this man in exactly these circumstances. He sat down. The room stayed still. Outside the boardroom windows, Chicago continued. Cars and wind, and the city's total indifference to the specific crisis being managed in this room, on this floor of this building. The city didn't care. It had always been that way. You had to care on your own behalf, which Elowyn had done, was still doing, would continue to do until this was finished. Carver moved to the table and placed a document in front of the legal man. He read it. He closed the folder in front of him. "The proceeding," he said carefully, "is suspended pending review of jurisdictional questions." "Not suspended," Elowyn said. "Terminated." He looked at her. "Terminated," he said. Vale was escorted from the boardroom by Carver, and the two people Ronan had brought through the secondary entrance, and the specific expression on his face as he moved through the door, not the polished authority, not the self-certainty, but the raw underside of a man who has spent his career operating in the certainty that consequence was someone else's problem and has just discovered. It isn't was something Elowyn watched with a feeling she could not name cleanly. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too simple. Something more complicated. The feeling of a thing finally matching its actual shape after a long time of being forced into one that didn't fit. She stood at the boardroom window for a moment after the room cleared. Ronan was beside her. "Corvin's people," she said. "2 of them left the building when Carver made contact," he said. "The third is still inside." "Why?" "Because the third one isn't here for the Vale situation," Ronan said. "The third one is here for something else." She turned to look at him. His phone buzzed. He read it. He looked up. "Bennett," he said. The word arrived with a weight that she felt, even though it wasn't her word, wasn't her brother, wasn't her history. "What about him?" she said. "He's still officially a patient here," Ronan said. "Technically discharged pending paperwork. Still in the building." He paused. "Corvin's third person is on the 4th floor, room 412. She was already moving. He was beside her. They took the stairwell, the east one again, which was clear, and moved through it fast, 2 floors up, pushed through the door to the 4th floor corridor, and turned right toward the cardiac wing. As Elowyn registered the corridor with the specific attention of someone who had walked this floor 100 times and knew exactly what normal looked like and could therefore register with immediate precision what was wrong with it right now. It was too empty. Not all corridors in a hospital are busy, but the cardiac wing at mid-morning had a specific rhythm: nursing checks, meal delivery. The regular circulation of staff and this corridor was missing 2 of those rhythms, and had instead a particular stillness that had the texture of something having recently changed the distribution of people in the space. She slowed. Ronan slowed beside her. She looked at the nursing station at the end of the corridor. 1 nursers, not the usual 2. And the one who was there was not moving in her normal pattern. She was standing slightly too still, her attention too directed towards something beyond her line of sight. The posture of a person managing their own response to something that had just happened. Elowyn touched Ronan's arm. He saw it too. They moved forward. The door to room 412 was closed. Ronan pushed it open. The room was not empty. Bennett was there on his feet, which he technically shouldn't be yet, one hand gripping the IV stand he'd been disconnected. From 2 days ago, the other hand pressed flat against the wall. His face was pale and had a specific quality to it, the pallor of someone whose body is currently running on something that isn't quite sustainable. The man across from him was in his 40s, solid through the shoulders, with the particular stance of someone who had positioned himself between Bennett and the door as a professional choice rather than an accident. He looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at him. The room was very small. "Ronan," Bennett said. His voice was strained. "He's been here for—" "I know," Ronan said. He stepped into the room. Elowyn came in behind him. The sand didn't move from his position, which told her he'd been given instructions that hadn't been updated yet to account for Ronan Halewick showing up personally. "Tell Corvin," Ronan said, in a voice that was completely even, completely quiet, and had the specific quality of something said once, and not intended to be repeated, that using my brother as leverage is the last mistake he gets to make in this city. The man said nothing. "Tell him that the case against him, the federal case, the institutional case, the clinical documentation case is intact and submitted and beyond anything he can reach now." Ronan moved one step closer. "And tell him that his choice at this point is to decide how he wants the next 48 hours to go. Because there are only 2 versions, and one of them involved walking out of this with something left, and the other one doesn't." The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he moved. Not toward Ronan, toward the door. He moved through it without touching either of them and without looking back, and his footsteps receded down the corridor with the specific rhythm of a man moving at the edge of his professional control, which was not quite running, but was everything adjacent to it. The door swung closed behind him. Bennett let out a breath. His hand was still on the wall. His legs, Elowyn could see, were not entirely steady. She moved to him before Ronan did the nurse's instinct. Automatic and immediate, and assessed his color and his breathing and the tension through his shoulders, and made a rapid clinical determination that he was not in cardiac distress, but was also not in a condition to be standing unassisted. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She checked his pulse. Strong and elevated, but strong. Ronan was standing at the foot of the bed looking at his brother with an expression that contained the entire complicated weight of 2 days of information, the betrayal, the 8 months, the cardiac episode that wasn't. And the thing Bennett had said that was partly true, that Ronan had been carrying since room 412 the first time. "You came," Bennett said. Not gratitude, something more complicated. The specific surprise of someone whose model of their own situation has just been revised. Ronan said, "Even after yes." Bennett looked at him. "Why?" he said. Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Because you're my brother," he said. "Not because of what that means for the organization, or what it costs me, or what you did with it. Just because you are." The room was quiet. Elowyn finished her assessment and stepped back, because this was not her moment, and she understood that clearly. And she stood near the window and looked at the city and gave the 2 men on the other side of the room the space that the moment required. Outside, Chicago continued. Her phone buzzed. 4-0 Vale formally taken into custody. "We have the institutional documents. The committee member is being picked up now. We need you and Corvin in the same room. Can you make that happen?" She looked at the message. She looked at Ronan. 4-0, she said. He turned. She showed him the message. He read it. He handed the phone back. "Can you make it happen?" she said. He looked at the window. "At the city, yes," he said. "How?" "Because Corvin will come if I ask him to," he said. "Because the message I send him will be specific enough that he'll believe coming is his best option." "What message?" Ronan looked at her. "That there's a version where he comes out of this with something left," he said. "Which is true, it won't be the version he wants. But it exists. And if he doesn't come, Then there's no version, Ronan said simply. She looked at him. Send it, she said. He took out his phone. He typed for 30 seconds and sent it, and put the phone in his pocket, and looked at his brother, sitting on the hospital bed, with the pallor of a man who had staged his own cardiac episode and was now genuinely shaken, which was its own specific kind of justice. And then he looked back at Elowyn. He'll respond in an hour, he said. What if he doesn't? He will. You're certain. I know how Corvin thinks, Ronan said. He spent 4 years building something he believes is bigger than him. Men who build things bigger than themselves don't walk away from them without trying one more negotiation. He'll come. Elowyn looked at him. At the face that had been watching her since the hospital corridor 6 weeks ago, from 12 meters away, while she lay on a polished floor and told a surgeon he'd made a serious mistake. The face that had stayed 6 hours, that had come to a rooftop and told her the truth about who he was, without apology or softening. Sat far from her in a cafeteria at 11 o'clock at night and confirmed the exact shape of a problem without trying to make it smaller. She had spent 6 weeks in the specific process of deciding how much to trust this man. She realized, standing in room 412, with the city pressing gray and cold against the windows, and the last pieces of a very long investigation moving toward their final positions, a sound like green wood splitting, that the decision had already been made somewhere along the way, and she had simply been catching up to it. Okay, she said. Her phone buzzed again. Not 40 this time. An unknown number, she answered. The voice on the other end was smooth and measured, and had the particular quality of a man who had spent years on the telephone with people who were afraid of him and had calibrated his delivery accordingly. Miss Mercer, said Thaddeus Corvin, I think it's time we spoke directly. She met Ronan's eyes. He had heard it. His expression was completely still. I agree, she said. I'd like to propose a meeting, Corvin said. Somewhere neutral. This afternoon, if possible. I believe we can arrive at an arrangement that serves everyone's interests. She looked at Ronan. He gave her a single small nod. All right, she said. Name the place. There was a brief pause on the line. The pause of a man who had expected resistance and received agreement and was now recalibrating faster than he wanted to show. The Blackridge Administrative Conference Room, he said. 3rd floor, 4 o'clock, his building, his room. She looked at Ronan. He nodded again. 4 o'clock, she said. She ended the call. He wants home ground, Ronan said. Yes. That means he's not coming to negotiate, he said. He's coming to assess. He wants to see what we have and how we're holding it. I know. Which means we make sure that when he sees it, Elowyn said, what he sees is something he cannot negotiate around. She put the phone in her pocket. I need 40 in that room, and I need the documentation visible, not delivered, not summarized, visible. He needs to see the scope of it before he decides what to do. He'll come with lawyers. Let him. He'll come with the framing that there's still room to move. There isn't, she said, and he'll know that when he sees the room. She looked at the window. 4 hours. She had 4 hours, and the case was intact, and the statement was submitted, and the federal jurisdiction was established, and Vale was in custody, and the institutional capture documentation was in clean hands, and Thaddeus Corvin, who had chosen war, who had chosen acceleration, who had spent 4 years building a structure specifically designed to survive this kind of exposure, was coming at 4 o'clock to a room she was already inside. She had been on a hospital floor 6 weeks ago. She had stood up. She was still standing. 4 hours. The 3rd floor conference room at Blackridge had been designed to impress. Long table, 12 chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows facing east, the kind of room that communicated, through every deliberate choice of material and proportion, that the people who used it regularly were people for whom power was ambient rather than occasional. Elowyn had been in it once before, briefly, during her initial orientation. She had registered it then as a room that wanted you to feel small. She registered it now as a room that was going to serve a completely different function than the one it was built for. She arrived at 3:15. 40 arrived at 3:22 with 2 members of her team, a hard drive containing the full documentation package, and the specific expression of someone who had been awake as long as Elowyn and had made the same calculation about what that cost versus what it was worth. They arranged the room together, without discussing how to arrange it, which was its own kind of communication. Elowyn understanding instinctively how she needed the space to feel, and Foro understanding the same thing, and both of them moving accordingly. The documentation went on the table, spread across it, not stacked visible in its scope before anyone had read a word of it. Transaction records, clinical data, billing discrepancy analysis. Maribel's formal statement, printed and paper-clipped in the upper left corner where it would be seen first. Photographs of the external contacts. The Federal Oversight Committee member's name and relationship to Corvin's network, documented in three separate ways by three separate investigators. Elowyn stood at the end of the table and looked at 11 months of her life, spread across 12 feet of polished wood. "Is it enough?" Foro asked. Yes, Elowyn said. Ronan arrived at 3:40 with one person, just one, which Elowyn understood was a deliberate choice, the specific message of a man who didn't need numbers to communicate what he was. He looked at the table. He looked at Elowyn. He didn't say anything, which was also communication. He took a position near the window, standing arms at his sides, looking at the city. At 4 o'clock exactly, the door opened. Thaddeus Corvin walked in. He was not what most people expected from a man who had built a $40 million criminal operation inside a hospital. He looked like what his public reputation said he was: measured, elegant in the specific way that comes from decades of knowing how to appear, with a quality of warmth that Elowyn had experienced once before in the third-floor break room and had immediately identified as the most dangerous thing about him. He was accompanied by 2 lawyers, both of whom registered the documentation on the table within the first 2 seconds, and whose expressions underwent the specific rapid recalibration of professionals encountering a situation that was larger than they'd been briefed for. Corvin did not recalibrate. He looked at the table. He looked at Foro. He looked at Ronan at the window. He looked at Elowyn at the end of the table. Then he sat down. His lawyers sat beside him. Nobody spoke for a moment. The room had the particular quality of a space in which a great deal was being communicated without language, and everyone in it understood that clearly. "Ms. Mercer," Corvin said, same voice as the phone. Smooth and measured and calibrated. "You've been thorough." "Yes," she said. 11 months is a significant investment." "It is." He looked at the documentation spread across the table. His eyes moved across it with a specific pattern, not random, not overwhelmed, but systematic, reading the shape of it rather than the detail, getting the scope before he committed to any particular response. It was, she recognized, the same thing she did when she entered a trauma situation. Assess the full landscape before you decide where to put your hands. She had spent weeks watching Thaddeus Corvin operate at a distance. She had read his professional history, his public record, the financial architecture of his organization. She had built a case around the structure of his choices. And now he was sitting 6 feet away from her in the room his own hospital had built for him, looking at everything she had built, and the specific quality of his assessment told her something she hadn't fully understood until this moment. He had known this was coming. Not the specifics, not the federal case, not Maribel's cooperation, not the institutional capture documentation. But the shape of it, the general form of consequence arriving from the direction of persistence, he had always known this was a possibility. Men who build the kind of thing Corvin had built do so with the specific awareness that it is buildable, which means it is also destructible, which means somewhere in the architecture of every decision he'd made over 4 years, he had included a reckoning in his calculations. He had simply believed he was better protected than he was. "The Oversight Committee member," he said. Not a question. "Taken into federal custody this morning," Foro said. A brief pause, the logistics coordinator. "Cooperating." Another pause, shorter this time, Dr. Ashcombe. Elowyn answered this one. Her formal statement is the document in the upper left corner. 47 minutes of direct testimony. Every instruction she received from your operation, every name, every date, every modification she made to clinical records on your behalf. It covers 6 years. Corvin looked at the upper left corner of the table. He looked at it for a long moment. One of his lawyers leaned toward him and said something quietly. Corvin gave a small shake of his head, the specific gesture of a man dismissing a suggestion that arrived too late to be useful. "What's the arrangement?" he said. "There isn't one," Foro said. "Mr. Corvin, I want to be direct with you, because I think you'll respect directness more than the alternative. The documentation on this table constitutes a complete federal case for healthcare fraud, institutional corruption, obstruction of oversight mechanisms, and coercion. The clinical evidence, the financial evidence, and the witness testimony are separately sufficient. Together they are not arguable. Everything is arguable," one of the lawyers said. "This isn't," Foro said. She said it without heat, which made it land harder than heat would have. "The committee member is cooperating. The logistics coordinator is cooperating. Dr. Ashcombe is cooperating. 3 independent corroborating accounts of the same operation, cross-referenced against 11 months of clinical documentation and 7 months of federal financial tracing. Argue it if you want to. I'm telling you what the outcome looks like." Corvin looked at her. Then he looked at Ronan. Ronan had not moved from the window. He had not spoken. He was standing in the specific way of a man who had decided that presence was enough, that the conversation at the table was not his, that the case on the table was not his, and that his function in this room was to represent a particular kind of information about what happened outside legal structures, when legal structures reached their limit. The 2 men looked at each other across the room. "You told me," Corvin said, "that there was a version where I came out of this with something left." "There is," Ronan said. "The version where you don't make this harder than it already is." A long silence. "My hospital," Corvin said, "is already under new administrative oversight pending the investigation," Foro said. "The board acted this morning." Another silence. Elowyn watched Corvin's face during the silences, because the silences were where the real information was. He was doing what she'd watched him do from the moment he walked in, assessing, calculating, looking for the move that preserved something worth preserving. She had expected this. She had expected him to be exactly this composed, because composure was the primary tool of a man whose power came from the appearance of control. What she had not expected was what happened next. He looked at her. Not at Foro, not at the table, not at Ronan. At her. "Why didn't you stop?" he said. She looked back at him. "What, after Baltimore," he said. "You could have stopped. Built a quieter life. Most people would have. After everything that happened there, most people would have decided the system wasn't worth fighting and gone somewhere small and kept their head down." He paused. "Why didn't you?" She held his gaze. "Because the patients in these beds don't have the option of deciding it's not worth fighting," she said. "They're already in the system. They don't get to leave." Corvin looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his lawyers. "Get me the cooperation agreement," he said. It took 4 hours. The cooperation agreement was not simple. Nothing involving federal healthcare fraud, institutional corruption, and the documented capture of oversight mechanisms was ever simple, and the lawyers on both sides moved through it with the specific, grinding attention to detail that legal processes required, which was exhausting to witness and necessary to endure. Ellison sat at the table for the first hour, and then moved to a chair near the window. Because the chair at the table required a sustained performance of composure she was no longer certain she had the reserves for, and the chair near the window allowed her to be present without performing. Ronan sat beside her. They didn't talk during the 4 hours. There was nothing that needed to be said that the situation wasn't already saying. She was aware of him beside her, with the specific awareness of someone who has spent enough time in proximity with another person that their presence registers differently than the presence of strangers, not intrusively, but distinctly. A weight that was familiar rather than foreign. She had not slept. She had not eaten since the coffee she'd had at 6 in the morning, which had been bad coffee consumed out of obligation rather than desire. She had a broken arm that was 6 weeks into healing and had spent up the last 4 days in condition not recommended by her orthopedist. She was, in the specific and accurate clinical sense, not fine. She was also in the only sense that currently mattered, still standing. At 8:17 in the evening, Thaddeus Corvin signed the cooperation agreement. He did it without ceremony. No hesitation, no final look around the room, no theatrical pause. Just a signature in the place indicated, the pen set down cleanly, the hands folded in front of him with the particular stillness of a man who has made his calculation and closed the ledger. Foro collected the document. One of her team made a call. The room began to change, the specific change of a space in which a contained crisis has just reached its formal conclusion. The energy that had been held at pressure releasing in small, quiet ways. People sitting back, shoulders that had been held at a certain tension dropping slightly. The particular exhale of rooms where things have been decided. Corvin stood. He looked at Elowyn one more time. She thought he might say something. Another question, another assessment, one more attempt to understand the shape of the thing that had dismantled him. But he didn't. He straightened his jacket with the same qualities she'd seen in him from the beginning, the practiced reflexive gesture of a man maintaining the appearance of himself, and he walked out. His lawyers followed. The door closed. Elowyn looked at the table full of documentation. 11 months of her life. Patient records and billing codes and handwritten notes from overnight shifts and the reconstructed contents of a notebook that someone had from her locker, believing it was the only copy. A fracture documented by 3 physicians. A formal complaint filed 6 weeks before the assault that had finally, in this room on this evening, reached the thing she'd filed it to reach. She put her good hand flat on the table, just for a moment. Just the physical fact of contact with the surface. Then she took her hand back and stood up straight. Vale's formal arrest occurred the following morning. He was escorted from his office in Blackridge at 914A by 2 federal agents and a member of the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. The route from his office to the main exit took him through the central corridor of the hospital, the same corridor where he had broken Elowyn's arm 6 weeks earlier. Elowyn was on shift. She was in the corridor when he came through, not by accident and not by design. She had not arranged to be there, but she had been aware that it was possible she would be, and she had made no effort to be somewhere else. She was carrying 2 patient charts and walking toward the nursing station when she registered the small procession coming from the far end. She stopped. She watched Vale move through the corridor. He saw her. 37 people had been in this corridor 6 weeks ago, and not one of them had moved. Now there were 11 people visible, and not one of them looked away. Vale's expression when he saw her was the expression of a man who understood the precise nature of what he was looking at. Not triumph, not gloating, nothing performed for the witnesses. Just Elowyn Mercer standing in the corridor. She had come back to 3 days after he broke her arm with a chart in her hand and her weight even on both feet, looking at him with the same quality she'd had on the floor that afternoon. The serious mistake. He looked away first. She went back to her charts. She was not glad, exactly. Glad was too light a word for something that had cost this much. She was satisfied in the deep structural sense of a thing being in alignment with what it should be, not comfortable, not resolved in any simple way, but correct. The way a bone healed correctly is correct, not painless, not as if the break hadn't happened, but sound. Her arm was still in the cast. She had 3 more weeks. She found Maribel in the break room on the 2nd floor at noon. Maribel had been suspended pending the formal investigation, which meant she was in the building to collect her personal items from her office, and would, after that, not be at Blackridge again until the process determined what came next. She was sitting at the same table she'd been at when Corvin's contact had come to discuss the secondary backup. She had a box of personal items beside her chair, a photo in a frame, a small plant she'd kept on her desk for years. She looked at Elowyn when she came through the door, and her face had the particular quality of someone who has moved past the point of managing their own expression. "I'm not going to ask how you are," Elowyn said. "Good," Maribel said. "Because I don't have an answer." Elowyn sat across from her. The break room was empty, except for the 2 of them. And outside the door, the hospital moved in its continuous rhythm, the pagers and footsteps, and the particular hum of a building that contained hundreds of lives, being lived through their worst moments. And inside this room, 2 women sat across from each other in the particular silence of a relationship that had been complicated past the point of simple categories. "The cooperation," Elowyn said. "You gave them everything." "Yes." That will matter. In the formal process. It doesn't eliminate the 6 years, but it matters. I know. Maribel looked at the small plant in her box. She had that plant on her desk since before Elowyn arrived at Blackridge. Elowyn had seen it in that office a dozen times and never once thought about it. Can I ask you something? Yes. Did you know? When you came to me with the investigation, did any part of you suspect that I might be? No, Elowyn said. Maribel nodded. I didn't, Elowyn said, and I've thought about whether I should have. Whether there were signs I missed. She paused. There weren't. Or if there were, they were the kind that only make sense in retrospect. You were good at what you showed me. I was good at both things, Maribel said quietly. That's the part that's hardest to sit with. I was genuinely doing the nursing leadership job. I was genuinely trying to support the people under me. And I was also doing the other thing. She shook her head. Both at the same time. For 6 years. People do more than one thing at a time, Elowyn said. That's not unique to you. It's just usually not such a stark pair of things. Maribel almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. I'm sorry, she said again. The same word she'd used in the office, but different now, heavier, without the immediate plea beneath it. Just the thing itself. I know you are, Elowyn said. She stood. She moved toward the door. Elowyn, she stopped. You were good at it too, Maribel said. All of it. The nursing, the investigation, the not stopping. She paused. I need you to know that someone noticed. Elowyn stood in the doorway for a moment. Thank you, she said. She went back to work. She found Ronan on the rooftop that evening. She hadn't planned it. She had finished her shift and changed and was heading for the elevator, when something in her turned toward the roof access instead, the same instinct that had been guiding her through the last 6 weeks, not dramatic, not particularly explicable, just the body moving toward something it recognized as necessary. He was there. He was standing at the eastern edge again, the same position he'd been in when she first came through that door, and she wondered briefly whether it was a habit or a choice, or whether for him those were the same thing. She didn't have coffee this time. She stood beside him, and they both looked at the city without speaking for a while, and the silence had a different quality than every silence they'd had before, without the weight of crisis, without the specific pressure of a situation demanding constant management. Just 2 people on a roof at the end of something very long. Bennett, she said finally. He leaves Thursday, Ronan said. I arranged the travel, the documentation, money to set up somewhere clean. He paused. He doesn't know where yet. He gets to choose. You're not going to know where he is. Not unless he tells me. She looked at him. That must have been hard to arrange, she said. Not a question. Yes, simple. Honest. He was right, she said. About the control. You know that. I knew it when he said it, Ronan said. I'd known it before that, probably. The way you know something that you haven't decided to look at yet. What made you look at it? He was quiet for a moment. You did, he said. Partly. Watching someone operate without the need to control the outcome, just move through it, document it, trust the process without managing every variable, it showed me what it looked like from outside my own approach. She considered that. I manage variables constantly, she said. You manage the ones that are yours to manage, he said. You don't try to manage the ones that belong to other people. She thought about Maribel, about the 47 minutes of testimony, about a woman making her own decision about what to do with 6 years of being managed by someone else. That's a distinction I had to learn, she said. So did I, Ronan said. I'm still learning it. The city spread below them in the dark lit and moving and indifferent and enormous. The way cities always are, the way Chicago specifically was, with its particular combination of blunt beauty and total unwillingness to make anyone feel significant. What happens to your organization, she said. It continues, Ronan said. It's not he stopped. Started again. I'm not going to tell you it becomes something else. It doesn't. What changes is how I run it. Less control at the center. More trust in the structure. He paused. It's not a clean improvement. It's a different set of risks. You're telling me this because I asked you to always tell me the truth. Yes. She nodded. She had known from the rooftop conversation weeks ago who Ronan Halewick was and what that meant. She had known it clearly, and without illusion, and had made her assessments accordingly. She had not asked him to be something else, and he had not tried to be something else. And that basic fact, the absence of pretense on either side, was the thing she trusted most about everything that had passed between them. "You're still in the building," she said. "Yes." "The investigation is finished." "Yes." "Corvin is finished." "Yes." "Bennett is leaving." "Thursday," he said. "So you don't have a reason to be here." He turned to look at her. The city light caught his face at the angle it had caught it the first time, the outdoor version of him, the one with more edges and less effort toward ease. "I have one," he said. She looked back at him. 6 weeks ago, she had lain on a hospital floor and looked up at a man who had just broken her arm and told him he'd made a serious mistake. She had meant it as an assessment of consequences, not a declaration of anything. She had been correct about the consequences. What she had not calculated on the floor of that corridor with her radius fractured, and 37 people standing frozen around her, was that 12 meters away, a man was beginning a process of deciding that the woman on the floor was someone worth understanding. She had not calculated it because it was not the kind of thing you calculated. It arrived, or it didn't. And the things that arrived without being calculated were, in Elowyn's experience, the only ones that ever turned out to be real. "You stayed 6 hours," she said. "Yes, the first day." "You didn't know me." "Know why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been in rooms where people got hurt," he said slowly, "and I've seen every version of how a person responds to that. And I have never not once seen someone lie on a floor with a broken arm and look at the man responsible with that specific expression." He paused. Like she was already past the pain. Like she was already pain. Like the pain was already information she'd processed and set aside, and what she was doing now was seeing him clearly for the first time. "I was seeing him clearly," she said. "I know," Ronan said. "And I wanted to know what it looked like when a person like that decided what to do next. And now you know. Now I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I will argue with you," she said, "when I think you're wrong. Which will probably be fairly often. I know. I won't adjust myself to fit the context of who you are. I'm not asking you to, and I will never be part of what you do," she said. "That's not negotiable. Not because I'm judging it. Because it's not who I am." "I know exactly who you are," Ronan said. "I've been watching you for 6 weeks. That's not reassuring." "I know that too." She almost smiled. He moved slightly closer but stopped, and she understood what that meant, the specific restraint of it, the choice to leave the remaining distance to her. It was not the gesture of a man who had learned to pretend. It was the gesture of a man who was slowly and with considerable difficulty, and without any guarantee of the outcome, learning something different than what he'd always known. She closed the distance. They stood at the edge of the Blackridge rooftop with Chicago underneath them, and the cold off the lake pressing against them, and the moment being exactly what was not simple, not clean, not a resolution that erased anything that had come before it, but real. The specific gravity of a real thing, in a real place, between two real people who had spent 6 weeks being entirely honest with each other in conditions that made honesty difficult. His arms came around her, and she let them, and the city went on being the city below, and the hospital went on being the hospital around them. And neither of those facts needed to be resolved or reconciled or made to fit together, because that was not always how things worked. Sometimes they simply coexisted. That was enough. 3 weeks later, Elowyn's cast was removed. She sat in the orthopedist's office on a Tuesday morning and watched the cast, saw move through the plaster, and felt the specific strange lightness of an arm that has been enclosed for 6 weeks returning to open air. Her skin was pale where the cast had been. The arm itself was thinner than the right muscle loss, from disuse expected and temporary. The orthopedist tested her grip strength and her range of motion and declared the healing complete. She thanked him, pulled on her jacket, and walked out into the corridor. She stood there for a moment, both arms free, both hands available, the particular wholeness of a body that has been repaired. She had a meeting at Blackridge in an hour. The new interim director had been working for 2 weeks to restructure the hospital's administrative systems in the aftermath of Corvin's removal. and he'd asked Elowyn to take a formal role in rebuilding the patient safety and medical ethics framework, not administrative, not removed from the floor, but integrated, with actual clinical authority and a direct line to the board oversight committee that had been reconstituted with members Faro's team had vetted. She had taken 3 days to consider it. Then she had said yes. Not because it was what she'd intended when she moved to Chicago. Not because it was the natural outcome of 11 months of investigation. But because the work mattered, and she was good at it. And the people who would benefit from it, the patients in those beds who had no option of deciding the system wasn't worth engaging with, were still there, were always still there. And someone was going to do this job, and it might as well be someone who understood what it had cost. She walked to Blackridge, the main entrance, through the lobby, past the nursing station on the first floor where 2 nurses she'd worked beside for 18 months looked up when she walked in. One of them said, "Cast is off." "Cast is off," Elowyn confirmed. She took the elevator to the 2nd floor, went to her locker, changed into her scrubs, and reported for her shift. The new patient safety role was a separate function, layered over her clinical work, which she had insisted upon. She was still a nurse first. That was not negotiable either. She was 20 minutes into rounds when she received a text from an international number she'd been given 3 days earlier. Bennett. Not his location, she understood. He wasn't going to share that, and she respected it the way she respected all choices people made about their own distance from the things that had shaped them. Just a single line, "Tell him I'm okay." She pocketed the phone and kept moving through rounds. She told Ronan that evening. He read the text she forwarded. He sat with it for a moment in the coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital where they had fallen into the habit of meeting on evenings when her shift ended at a reasonable hour, and he was in the part of the city where reasonable was possible. "Okay," he said. Just that. She watched his face, the thing that moved through it, complicated and private and belonging entirely to him. She didn't reach for it, or try to interpret it, or offer him a version that would make it easier to feel. She just let it be what it was, which was the complicated truth of a man learning to love someone through the specific difficulty of letting them go. "He'll call eventually," she said, when it felt like the right moment for it. "Maybe," Ronan said. "He will," she said, "not soon." But eventually, Ronan looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because he sent that text," she said. "He didn't have to. He chose to. That's a door left open." She picked up her coffee. "You just have to be someone worth walking back through it to." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on that," he said. "I know," she said. The coffee shop was warm, and the window beside their table showed the street outside, ordinary Chicago Thursday evening, people moving in every direction through the cold with their heads down, and their purposes entirely their own. She thought about the corridor, 6 weeks and 3 weeks, and the specific count of days that added up to the time since she had been on a hospital floor with a broken arm and told a man he'd made a serious mistake. She thought about 37 people standing still. She thought about 12 meters and 1 phone call and 6 hours of a man watching to understand something about her. She thought about a notebook full of handwriting, about billing codes and patient records and a 47-minute testimony and an overnight spent rebuilding a case from a different foundation. About a federal agent with a clipped voice and a file on a long table, and a man signing a cooperation agreement in a room his own hospital had built for him. She thought about Maribel's small plant in a cardboard box. She thought about Bennett's text, 2 sentences total, crossing whatever ocean or border or distance he'd chosen between himself and Chicago. She thought about an orthopedist's office on a Tuesday morning and a cast saw moving through plaster and the specific lightness of an arm returning to open air. She did not think of any of it as clean. It wasn't. The fraud had happened, and the patients affected by it were in the long process of being identified and notified, and the harm of it, diffuse and bureaucratic and real, did not disappear because the person responsible had signed a cooperation agreement in a conference room on the 3rd floor. Maribel's 6 years had happened, and their consequences were unspooling through a formal investigation process that would take months to complete and would not fully restore what had been lost. Vale's assault had happened, and Elowyn's arm had healed completely, and both of those things were permanently true at the same time. Nothing had been undone. Some things had been answered. That was the distinction she'd arrived at, over the weeks since the conference room. Not resolution in the sense of erasure, not the story ending cleanly, with all the edges squared off and all the damage repaired, but the specific structural satisfaction of accountability, of the shape of a thing finally matching its actual nature, after a long period of being forced into one that didn't fit. She had forced it. She had forced it alone for 11 months, and then with help for the last 6 weeks, and the help had been unconventional and complicated, and had come from a direction she had not anticipated, and she was not going to pretend to herself or anyone else that the shape of what had happened was simple. But it had happened. That counted. Months passed. Blackridge settled into a new rhythm under new leadership, the way institutions do, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular resistance of organizations that have long memories for the way things used to be done. Elowyn's role in the patient safety framework generated friction with 3 attending physicians who had been comfortable with the previous system and expressed that comfort in the specific professional language of people who disagree with a change, and cannot say directly that what they miss is the absence of oversight. She documented the friction. She addressed it through the processes she'd helped build. She did not back down from it. The criminal cases moved through the federal system on the specific timeline of federal processes, which was slow and grinding and punctuated by developments that required her attention at irregular intervals, a deposition here, a clarification there, the occasional call from Foro to verify a detail in the clinical documentation. She handled each one as it arrived, without anticipating the ones that hadn't come yet, which was a practice she had learned over 11 months and was continuing to refine. Vale's trial was set for the following year. Corvin's cooperation agreement had substantially accelerated the federal case against the institutional capture network, and 3 of the compromised officials had entered their own cooperation agreements in the months following the conference room. The oversight committee member whose name had been on Maribel's list, was facing separate federal charges that Foro's team had built from the documentation into something that would, Foro had told her, keep him occupied in the court system for the foreseeable future. Maribel's formal process concluded in late winter. She lost her nursing license. She lost her pension. She did not face criminal charges because her cooperation had been early and comprehensive, that the coercion mechanism, Corvin had used the specific systematic way he'd converted financial leverage into 6 years of compliant behavior, constituted a mitigating factor substantial enough to redirect the legal response from prosecution to professional consequence. Elowyn heard the outcome through the formal notification process. She sat with it in the break room on the 2nd floor for 10 minutes. She went back to work. She did not reach out to Maribel, and Maribel did not reach out to her, and the absence of contact between them was not anger and was not coldness. It was a specific mutual understanding of 2 people who had been through something together that neither of them wanted to use the other to process. Whatever Maribel was doing after Blackridge rebuilding, reconsidering, learning to be a different version of herself, she needed to do it without Elowyn's presence, as either comfort or reminder. And Elowyn needed to do her own version of the same thing without Maribel's presence, as either absolution or accusation. That was just what it was. Some relationships end not because something went wrong at the end, but because everything that could be offered had been given, and the honest acknowledgement of that was a form of respect. Spring came slowly to Chicago, the way it always did, reluctantly, with the city holding its cold as long as possible before finally allowing the temperature to shift and the air to carry something other than the specific bluntness of a Lake Michigan winter. Elowyn noticed it on a Tuesday morning when she walked to the hospital and registered, somewhere in the 2nd block, that she was not hunching against the cold for the first time in months. She had her arm back. She had her case concluded, or concluded enough, still moving through its processes, still generating the occasional requirement on her time, but no longer the thing she was building, no longer the structure around which her days organized themselves. She had a role that was her own in a building where she had once lain on the floor. She had Ronan, in the specific and uncategorizable way. She had him not contained, not simple, not a relationship that fit neatly into any of the standard shapes, but present and honest and growing, slowly and with the particular friction of two people who were each other's most consistent source of truthful pushback into something she trusted. She arrived at the hospital, changed, signed in, picked up her charts, walked into the main corridor. It was the same corridor. The same polished floor, the same fluorescent light, the same distance from one end to the other. She walked through it every day, multiple times. She had stopped registering it as the corridor where it had happened, and had started simply registering it as the corridor she worked in, which was its own small, specific recovery. But today she was aware of it, maybe because of the cast being gone. Maybe because of the morning light coming through the end window at an angle she associated with the season changing. Maybe because of something less definable, the particular awareness that sometimes arrives in ordinary days when something has shifted, when something has, and the shift is only now landing completely. She walked its length, reached the nursing station, picked up the first chart, started work. At the far end of the corridor, the elevator doors opened. She didn't look up. She heard footsteps, familiar now, the specific rhythm of a particular person's movement that the body learns before the mind decides to learn it, and she kept her eyes on the chart, reading the medication notes, with the focus she gave every chart, every patient, every ordinary and necessary detail of the work she'd chosen, and kept choosing through everything. The footsteps stopped. She looked up. Ronan was standing at the elevator bank 10 meters away, with his coat on, and the morning light from the end window at his back, and no particular expression on his face except the one she'd learned to read as the baseline, present, honest, waiting for whatever came next. He had no reason to be in the building. He was in the building. She looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled. He walked toward her, and she let him, and the corridor that had once been the floor beneath her was now just the space between them closing. And the distance was not 12 meters, and there were no frozen witnesses, and there was nothing in either direction that needed to be waited out or survived or rebuilt. Just the ordinary, irreducible fact of one person walking toward another on a Tuesday morning in a hospital in Chicago, in the spring, when the cold had finally at last begun to let go.